2, Monday, January 13th. When they gathered in Ernie and Faye's kitchen for breakfast the next morning, Dom was excited to learn that the previous night had been an ordeal for most of them. "It's unraveling the way I hoped it might," he said. "By gathering together here, by recreating the group that was gathered here that night, and by working together to get at the truth, we're putting constant pressure on the memory blocks that have been implanted in us. And now that barrier is crumbling a bit faster." Last night, Dom, Ginger, Ernie, and Ned experienced exceptionally vivid nightmares of such similarity that they were surely fragments of forbidden memories. In every case, they had involved being strapped to motel beds and tended by men in decontamination suits. Sandy had a pleasant dream, although it lacked the clarity and detail of the others' nightmares. Faye was the only one who did not dream at all. Ned had been so disturbed by his nightmare that on Monday morning, when he and Sandy arrived from Biawau for breakfast, he announced they were moving into a room at the motel for the duration. "During the night after the dream woke me, I couldn't get back to sleep, and while I was laying here, I got to thinking how lonely it is at our trailer, empty planes all around. Maybe this Colonel Falkirk will decide to kill us like he wanted to do in the first place. And if he comes for us, I don't want me and Sandy to be alone out there at the trailer." Don sympathized with Ned because these dark and vivid dreams were new to the cook. Over recent weeks, Dom, Ginger, and Ernie had learned a little about coping with the frighteningly powerful nightmares, but Ned had developed no armor, so he was badly shaken. And, of course, Ned was well advised to fear Falkirk. The closer they came to exposing the conspiracy and learning the truth, the more likely they were to become targets of a preemptive strike. Dom did not think Falkirk would make a move until Brendan Cronin, Georgia Monatella, and perhaps other victims had gathered at the Tranquility. But once they were in one place, they would need to be prepared for trouble. Now, in the box kitchen, Ned Sarver picked at his breakfast without appetite as he spoke of the images that had disturbed his sleep. At first, he had dreamed of being held prisoner by men in decontamination suits, but later they had worn either lab coats or military uniforms, an indication that the biological danger had passed. One of the uniformed men had been Colonel Falkirk, and Ned described that officer in detail. About 50 years old, black hair graying at the temples, gray eyes like circles of polished steel, a beakish nose, thin lips. Ernie was able to confirm the word portrait that Ned painted, for Falkirk had also been in his nightmare. The amazing coincidence of the same man appearing in both Ned's and Ernie's dreams made it clear that his face was not merely a figment of imagination, but a memory of a real face that both Ernie and Ned had seen 2 summers ago. "And in my nightmare," Ernie said, "another army officer referred to Falkirk by his first name, Leland, Colonel Leland Falkirk. He is probably stationed at Shankfield," Ginger said. "We'll try to find out later," Dom said. The barriers to memory were definitely crumbling. That prospect boosted Dom's spirits higher than they had been in months. In Ginger's nightmare, which she recounted for them, she had not been the only person being brainwashed in room 5, the room she had occupied that summer and which she now occupied again. There was a rollaway bed in one corner, and the redhead in it was someone I'd never seen before. She was about 40 years old. They had her connected to her own IV drip and EKG machine. She had that vacant stare. Just as Ernie and Ned had shared a new development, the appearance of Colonel Falkirk in their nightmares, Dom and Ginger had shared this other discovery. In Dom's dream, there had been a rollaway bed flanked by an IV stand and an EKG monitor, and in the bed had been a young man in his 20s with a pale face, bushy mustache, and zombie eyes. What does it mean? Faye Block asked. Did they have so many subjects for brainwashing that they more than filled all 20 rooms? But Sandy said the registry showed only 11 rooms rented. Ginger said there must have been people in the interstate and transit who saw what we saw. The Army managed to stop them and bring them here. None of their names would appear on the registry. How many? Faye wondered. We'll probably never know for sure, Dom said. We never actually met them. We only shared rooms with them while we were drugged. We might eventually remember the faces of those we saw, but we can't possibly remember names and addresses we never knew in the first place. But at least those reprogrammed memories, those tissues of lies were dissolving, allowing the truth to show through. Dom was grateful for that much. In time, they would uncover the entire story, if Colonel Falkirk did not first come after them with heavy artillery. Monday morning, while the group at the Tranquility ate breakfast, Jack Twist was being escorted to a safe deposit box in a vault of a Fifth Avenue branch of Citibank in New York. The attending bank employee, an attractive young woman, kept calling him Mr. Farnham, for that was the false identity under which he had acquired the box. After they used their separate keys to remove the box from the wall of the vault, when he was alone with it in a cubicle, he opened the lid and stared in shock at the contents. The rectangular metal container held something that he had not put there, which was an impossibility since only he knew about the box and possessed the only master key. It should have contained 5 white envelopes, each filled with $5,000 in $100 and $20 bills, and indeed that money appeared to be untouched. This was one of 11 emergency caches he kept in safe deposit boxes all over the city. He had set out this morning to remove $15,000 from each, a total of $165,000, which he intended to give away. He opened each of the 5 envelopes and counted the contents with trembling hands. Not a single bill was missing. Jack was not even slightly relieved. Though his money was still there, the presence of the other object proved that his false identity had been penetrated, his privacy violated, and his freedom jeopardized. Someone knew who Gregory Farnham really was, and the item that had been left in the box was a bold notification that his elaborately constructed cover had been penetrated. It was a postcard. There was no writing on the back, no message. The presence of the card itself was message enough. On the front was a photograph of the Tranquility Motel. The summer before last, after he and Branch Pollard and a third man had burglarized the Avril McAllister estate in Marin County, north of San Francisco, and after Jack paid a profitable visit to Reno, he rented a car and drove east, stopping the first night at the Tranquility Motel along Interstate 80. He had not thought about the place since, but he recognized it the instant he saw the photograph. Who could possibly know he had stayed at that motel? Not Branch Pollard. He'd never told Branch about Reno or about his decision to drive back to New York. And not the third man on the McAllister job, a guy named Sal Finro from Los Angeles. Jack had never seen him again after they had split the take from that sour job. Then Jack realized that at least 3 of his phony IDs had been penetrated. He rented this safe deposit box as Farnham, but he stayed at the Tranquility Motel as Thornton Wainwright, both nom de guerre, N-O-M-S-D-E-G-U-E-R-R-E, I don't know what the phrase means, I guess it's French, were now blown, and the only way anyone could have linked them was by connecting Jack with his Philippe Delon identity, under which he resided at his Fifth Avenue apartment, so that name was blown as well. Jesus! He sat in the bank cubicle, stunned but thinking furiously, trying to decide who his enemy might be. It could not be the police or the FBI or any other legitimate authority. for they would simply have arrested him once they had accumulated this much evidence. They would not play games. Nor could it be any of the men with whom he ever worked on a heist, for he took great care to keep his acquaintances in the criminal underworld well out of his life on Fifth Avenue. None of them knew where he really lived. In the event they scouted a job requiring his planning skills and special knowledge, they could reach him only through a series of mail drops or through a chain of pseudonymously listed phone numbers backed up by answering machines. He was confident of the effectiveness of those precautions. Besides, if some hoodlum had gotten into this box, he would not have left the $25,000 untouched. He would have taken every dollar of it. So who's on to me, Jack wondered. He focused on the Fratellanza warehouse robbery that he and Morton Tommy Sung had pulled off December 3rd. Was the mafia after him? When they wanted to find someone, those boys had more contact sources, determination, and sheer perseverance than the FBI. And the Fratellanza would most likely not have taken the $25,000, leaving it as an ominous notice that they wanted more than the money he had stolen from them. It was also in character for the Fratellanza to leave a teaser like the postcard, because those guys enjoyed making a target sweat a lot before they finally pulled the trigger. On the other hand, even if the mob tracked him down, then somehow searched back through his criminal career to see who else he had hit, they would not have gone to the trouble of acquiring cards from the Tranquility Motel just to put the fear of God in him. If they had wanted to leave an upsetting teaser in the safe deposit box, they would have left a photo of the warehouse that he had robbed in New Jersey. So it was not the mafia. Then who? Damn it, who? The tiny cubicle began to seem even smaller than it was. Jack felt claustrophobic and vulnerable. As long as he was in the bank, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He stuffed the $25,000 into his overcoat pockets, no longer intending to give away any of it. Suddenly, it had become his escape money. He put the postcard in his wallet, closed the empty box, and rang the buzzer for the attendant. 2 minutes later, he was outside, drawing deep breaths of the freezing January air, studying the people on Fifth Avenue for one who might be tailing him. He saw no one suspicious. For a moment, he stood rock-like in the river of people that flowed around him. He wanted to get out of the city and the state as quickly as possible, flee to an unlikely destination where they would not look for him, whoever they were. Yet he was not entirely sure that flight was necessary. In ranger training, he had been taught never to act until he understood why he was acting, and until he knew what he hoped to achieve by his actions. Besides, fear of his faceless enemy was outweighed by curiosity. He needed to know who he was up against, how they had broken his various covers, and what they wanted from him. Outside the Citibank building, Jack hailed a cab and went to the corner of Wall Street and William Street, in the heart of the financial district, where he had 6 safe deposit boxes in 6 banks. He went to 5 of them, from each of which he collected $25,000 and a postcard of the Tranquility Motel. He decided to stop after the 5th because his coat pockets were already bulging with $125,000, a sufficiently dangerous sum to be carrying, and because by now he knew beyond a doubt that his other 6 phony identities and clandestine safe deposit boxes had been found out as well. He had enough money with which to travel, and he was not particularly worried about leaving the remaining $150,000 in the other 6 boxes. For one thing, Jack had $4 million in his Swiss accounts, and for another thing, the distributor of the postcards would already have taken the available money if that had been his intention. By now, he'd had time to think about that motel out in Nevada, and he had begun to realize something was strange about the time that he had spent at the place. He had remained there for 3 days, relaxing, enjoying the quiet and the scenery. But now, for the first time, it seemed to him that he would have done no such thing, not with so much cash in the trunk of his rental car, not when he had already been away from New York and Jenny for 2 weeks. He would have driven straight home from Reno. Now that he was forced to contemplate it, the 3-day stay at the Tranquility Motel did not make much sense. Another taxi conveyed him to his Fifth Avenue apartment building, where he arrived shortly before 11. He promptly telephoned Elite Flights, a company that chartered small jets with whom he had dealt previously, and he was relieved to discover that, fortuitously, they had an unbooked Lear available for departure at his convenience. He took the $25,000 from the secret compartment in the back of his bedroom closet. With the funds he had removed from the safe deposit boxes, he now had $150,000 in immediate operating capital, enough to deal with virtually any contingency that might arise. He hurriedly packed 3 suitcases, distributing a few clothes in each, but leaving most of the space for other items. He stowed away 2 handguns, a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Combat Magnum, chambered for the .357 Magnum cartridge, but also capable of firing 38 special cartridges with considerably less kick, and a .32 Beretta Model 70, its stubby barrel grooved to accept a screw-on pipe-type silencer, of which Jack included 2. He also took an Uzi submachine gun, which he'd illegally modified for full automatic fire, plus plenty of ammunition. Jack's newly acquired guilt had substantially transformed him during the past 48 hours, but it had not overwhelmed him to such an extent that he was incapable of dealing violently with those who might deal violently with him. His determination to be an honest and upstanding citizen did not interfere with his instinct for self-preservation, and considering his background, no one was better prepared to preserve himself than Jack Twist. Besides, after 8 years of alienation and loneliness, he had begun to rejoin society, had begun to hope for a normal life. He would not let anyone destroy what might be his last chance for happiness. He also packed the portable Slicks computer, which he had used to get through the armored transport's sophisticated electronic lock the night before last in Connecticut. In addition, he decided he might need a police lock release gun, a tool that could instantly open any type of pin tumbler lock, mushroom, spool, or regular, without damaging the mechanism, and which was sold only to law enforcement agencies. And a Startron MK202A, a compact handheld night vision device that could also be rifle mounted, and a few other things. Although he distributed the heaviest weapons and equipment equally among the 3 large suitcases, none of the bags was light when he finally closed and locked them. Anyone who helped him with his luggage might wonder about the contents, but no one would ask embarrassing questions or raise an alarm. That was the advantage of leasing a Learjet for the journey. He would not be required to pass through airport security, and no one would inspect his baggage. From his apartment, he taxied to LaGuardia. The waiting Lear would take him to Salt Lake City, Utah, the nearest major airport to Elko, a shade closer than Reno International and a lot closer if you considered the necessity of overflying to Reno and then doubling back in a conventional engine commuter plane to Elko. Elite Flights had told him that Reno was anticipating a major snowstorm that might close them down later in the day, and the same was true of the 2 smaller fields in southern Idaho that were capable of handling Lear-sized jets. But the weather forecast for Salt Lake City was good throughout the day. At Jack's request, Elite was already arranging the lease of a conventional engine plane from a Utah company to carry him from Salt Lake to the little county airport in Elko. Although it was in the easternmost fourth of Nevada, Elko was still within the Pacific time zone, so he would benefit from a gain of 3 hours, though he did not think he would arrive in Elko much before nightfall. That was all right. He'd need darkness for what he was planning. To Jack, the taunting postcards retrieved from his safe deposit boxes implied there were people in Nevada who had learned everything worth knowing about his criminal life. The cards seemed to be saying that he could reach those people through the Tranquility Motel, or perhaps find them in residence there. The postcard was an invitation, or a summons. Either way, he could ignore it only at his peril. He did not know if he was being followed to LaGuardia. He did not bother looking for a tail. If his apartment phone was tapped, they knew he was coming the moment he called Elite Flights. He wanted them to see him approaching openly, for then they might be off guard when, on arrival in Elko, he suddenly shook loose of them and went underground. Monday morning after breakfast, Dom and Ginger went into Elko to the offices of the Sentinel, the county's only newspaper. The biggest town in the county, Elko boasted a population of less than 10,000, so its newspaper's offices were not housed in a gleaming glass high-rise, but in a humble one-story concrete block building on a quiet street. Like most papers, the Sentinel provided access to its back-issue files to anyone with legitimate research needs, though permission for the use of the files was granted judiciously. In spite of the financial success of his first novel, Dom still had difficulty identifying himself as a writer. To his own ears, he sounded pretentious and phony, though he realized his uneasiness was a holdover from his days as an excessively self-effacing milquetoast. Capital Milquetoast. I don't know what that is. The receptionist, Brenda Hennerling, did not recognize his name, but when he mentioned the title of his novel that Random House had just shipped to the store, she said, "It's the book club selection of the month. You wrote it? Really?" She had ordered it a month ago from the Literary Guild, and it had just arrived in the mail. She was, she said, an avid reader, 2 books a week, and it was truly a thrill to meet a genuine novelist. Her enthusiasm only added to Dom's embarrassment. He was of a mind with Robert Louis Stevenson, who had said, "The important thing is the tale, the well-told tale, not he who tells it." The Sentinel's back issue files were kept in a narrow, windowless chamber. There were 2 desks with typewriters, a microfilm reader, a file of microfilm spools, and 6 tall filing cabinets with oversized drawers containing those editions of the newspaper that had not yet been transferred to film. The exposed concrete block walls were painted pale gray, and the acoustic tile ceiling was gray too, and the fluorescent light shed a cold glare. Dom had the odd sensation that they were in a submarine far beneath the surface of the sea. After Brenda Hennerling explained the filing system to them and left them alone to do their work, Ginger said, "I'm so caught up in our problems that I keep forgetting you're a famous author." "So do I," Dom said, reading the labels on the filing cabinets that held issues of past Sentinels. "But of course I'm not famous." "Soon will be. It's a shame. With all that's happening to us, you're getting no chance to savor the publication of your first novel." He shrugged. "This isn't a picnic for any of us. You've had to put an entire medical career on hold." "Yes, but now I know I'll be able to go back to medicine once we've dug to the bottom of this," Ginger said, as if there was no doubt they would triumph over their enemies. By now, Dom knew that conviction and determination were as much a part of her as the blueness of her eyes. "But this is your first book." Dom had not yet recovered from his embarrassment at being treated like a celebrity by the receptionist. Now Ginger's kind comments kept a blush on his cheeks. However, this was not the mark of embarrassment. It was an indication of the intense pleasure he took in being the object of her concern. No woman had ever affected him as this one did. Together, they went through the file drawers and removed the pertinent back issues of the Sentinel. They would not need to use the microfilm reader, for the newspaper was running 2 years behind in the transfer to film. They withdrew a full week's editions, beginning with Saturday, July 7 of the summer before last, and took them to one of the desks where they both pulled up chairs. Although the unremembered event that they had witnessed and the possible contamination and the closure of I-80 had happened on Friday night, July 6, the Saturday paper carried no report of the toxic spill. The Sentinel was primarily a source of local and state news, and though it included some national and international material, it was not interested in fast-breaking stories. Its halls would never ring with that dramatic cry, "Stop press!" There would be no last-minute recomposition of the front page. The pace of life in Elko County was rural, relaxed, sensible, and no one felt a burning need to be breathlessly up to the minute on anything. The Sentinel was put to bed late in the evening for distribution in the morning. Therefore, since no Sunday edition was published, the story of the toxic spill and the closure of I-80 did not appear until the edition of Monday, July 9. But Monday and Tuesday's editions were emblazoned with urgent headlines. Toxic spill closes I-80, and Army establishes quarantine zone, and nerve gas leaking from damaged truck, and Army says everyone evacuated from danger zone, and where are evacuees, and Schenkfield Army testing grounds. What really goes on there? And I-80 closure enters 4th day, and cleanup almost finished, highway open by noon. For both Dom and Ginger, it was eerie to read about these events that had transpired during days when they remembered nothing more than relaxing quietly at the Tranquility Motel. As Dom read about the crisis, he became convinced Ginger's theory was correct. It seemed obvious that the mind-control technicians would have needed an extra week or two in order to have incorporated this elaborate toxic spill cover story into the phony memories of both Elko County locals and passers-through, and there was no way they could have kept the highway closed and the area sealed tight for that long. The edition of Wednesday, July 11 continued the saga. I-80 opens and quarantine removed, no long-term contamination, and first evacuees located. They saw nothing. Editions of the Sentinel, distinctly a small-town paper, averaged between 16 and 32 pages. During those days in July, most of its news space was given to reports of the toxic crisis, for this event had drawn reporters from all over the country, and the low-key Sentinel found itself at the center of a big story. Poring over that wealth of material, Dom and Ginger discovered a lot that was pertinent to their quest and that would help them plan their next move. For one thing, the degree of security imposed by the United States Army was soberly instructive of the lengths to which they would go to keep the lid on the truth. Although it was not strictly within their authority to do so, Army units attached to Schenkfield had established roadblocks and closed a 10-mile stretch of I-80 immediately after the accident. They had not even informed the Elko County Sheriff or the Nevada State Police of the crisis until they had secured the quarantine zone. That was a startling breach of standard procedure. Throughout the emergency, the sheriff and state police complained with increasing vehemence that the Army was freezing them out of every aspect of crisis management and usurping civilian authority. State and local police were neither included in the maintenance of the quarantine line nor consulted on essential contingency planning for the possibility that increased winds or other factors might spread the nerve gas beyond the initial area of danger. Clearly, the military trusted only its own people to keep the secret of what was actually happening in the quarantine zone. Following 2 days of frustration, Foster Hanks, the Elko County Sheriff, had complained to a Sentinel reporter that this here's my bailiwick, by God, and the people elected me to keep peace. This is no military dictatorship. If I don't get some cooperation from the Army, I'll see a judge first thing tomorrow and get a court order to make them respect the legal jurisdiction in this matter. The Tuesday Sentinel reported that Hanks had indeed gone before a judge, but before a determination could be made, the crisis was drawing to an end, and the argument about jurisdiction was moot. Huddling over the newspaper with Dom, Ginger said, "So we don't have to worry that all authorities are aligned against us in this. The state and local police weren't part of it. Our only adversary is the United States Army," Dom finished, laughing at the unconscious element of graveyard humor in her assessment of the enemy. She also laughed sourly. Us against the Army. Even with state and local police out of the battle, it's hardly a fair match, is it? According to the Sentinel, the Army kept sole and iron control of the roadblocks on I-80, the only east-to-west artery through Forbidden Territory, and also closed 8 miles of the north-south county road. Civilian air traffic was restricted from passing over the contaminated area, necessitating the rerouting of flights, while the Army maintained continuous helicopter patrols of the perimeter of the proscribed land. Obviously, substantial manpower was required to secure 80 square miles, but regardless of expense and difficulty, they were determined to stop anyone entering the danger zone on foot, on horseback, or in four-wheel drive vehicles. The choppers flew in daylight and after dark as well, sweeping the night with searchlights. Rumors circulated that teams of soldiers equipped with infrared surveillance gear were also patrolling the perimeter at night, looking for interlopers who might have slipped past the big chopper searchlights. Nerve gases rate among the deadliest substances known to man, Ginger said as Dom turned a page of the newspaper they were currently perusing. But even so, this much security seems excessive. Besides, though I'm no expert on chemical warfare, I can't believe any nerve gas would pose a threat at such a distance from a single point of release. I mean, according to the Army, it was only 1 cylinder of gas, not an enormous quantity. Not a whole tanker truck, as Ernie and Faye remembered it. And it's the nature of gas to disperse, to expand upon release. So by the time the stuff spread a couple of miles, it would have been diluted to such a degree that surely the air would have contained no more of it than a few parts per billion. In 3 miles, not even 1 part per billion, not enough to endanger anyone. This supports your idea that it was biological contamination. Possibly, Ginger said. It's too early to say, but it was certainly more serious than the nerve gas story they put out. By Saturday, July 7, less than 1 day after the interstate was closed, an alert wire service reporter had noted that the uniforms of many of the soldiers in the quarantine operation bore, in addition to rank and standard insignia, an unusual company patch, a black circle with an emerald green star in the center. This was different from the markings on the uniforms of the men from Schenkfield testing grounds. Among those wearing the green star, the ratio of officers to enlisted men was high. When questioned, the Army identified the Green Star soldiers as a little-known super elite company of Special Forces troops. We called them DERO, which stands for Domestic Emergency Response Organization. An Army spokesman was quoted by the Sentinel. The men of DERO are superbly trained, and they've all had extensive field experience in combat situations, and all of them carry top security clearances as well, which is essential because they may find themselves operating in highly classified areas, witness to sensitive sites. Dom translated that to mean DERO men were chosen in part for their ability and willingness to keep their goddamn mouths shut. The Sentinel quoted the Army spokesman further. They're the cream of our young career soldiers, so naturally many have attained the rank of at least sergeant by the time they qualify for Darrow. Our intention is to create a superbly trained force to deal with extraordinary crises, such as terrorist attacks on domestic military installations, nuclear emergencies on bases housing atomic weapons, and other unusual problems. Not that there is any aspect of terrorism involved in this case, and there's no nuclear emergency here either. But several Darrow companies are stationed around the country, and since one was near when this nerve gas situation arose, it seemed prudent to bring in the best we had to ensure public safety. He refused to tell reporters where this Darrow company had been stationed, how far they had been flown, or how many were involved. That's classified information. Not one of the Darrow men would speak with any member of the press. Ginger grimaced and said, "Schmonsies." Dom blinked. Huh? Their whole story? She said, leaning back in her chair and rolling her head from side to side to work out a cramp in her lovely neck. It's all just schmonsies. But what's schmonsies? Oh, sorry. Yiddish word, adapted from German, I guess. One of my father's favorites. It means something of no value, something foolish, absurd, nonsense, worthy of contempt or scorn. This stuff the Army put out is just schmonsies. She stopped, rolling her head, leaned forward in her chair, and stabbed one finger at the newspaper. So this Darrow team just happened to be hanging around here in the middle of nowhere, precisely when this crisis arose, huh? Too damn neat. Dom frowned. But, Ginger, according to these stories, although the roadblocks on I-80 were set up by men from Schenkfield, the Darrow team took over a little more than an hour later. So if they didn't just happen to be nearby, the only way they could have gotten here so quickly was if they were airborne and on their way before the accident ever happened. Exactly. You're saying they knew in advance there'd be a toxic spill? She sighed. At most, I'm willing to accept a Darrow team might have been at one of the nearest military bases in western Utah or maybe up in southern Idaho. But even that's not near enough to make the Army scenario work. Even if they dropped everything and flew in here the moment they heard about this spill, they couldn't have been manning those roadblocks within an hour. No way. So, yeah, it sure looks to me as if they had a little advance warning that something was going to happen out at the western end of Valco County. Not much warning, mind you, not days, but maybe a 1 or 2 hour advance notice. Which means the toxic spill couldn't have been an accident. In fact, probably wasn't a spill at all, neither chemical nor biological. So why in hell were they wearing decontamination suits when they were treating us? Dom was frustrated by the elaborate maze of this mystery, which twisted and turned inward, but not toward a solution, toward nothing but twistier and more complex pathways that led into ever deeper puzzlement. He had the irrational urge to tear the newspapers to shreds, as if by ripping them to pieces, he would also be ripping apart the Army's lies, and would somehow find the truth revealed, at last, in the resultant confetti. With a note of frustration that matched his own, Ginger said the only reason the Army called in a Darrow company to enforce the quarantine was because the men patrolling the zone would have a view of something highly classified, something absolutely top secret. The Army felt they couldn't trust ordinary soldiers who didn't have the very highest security clearance. That's the sole reason the Darrow team was used, because they could be trusted to keep their mouths shut. Yes, and if it had been nothing more than a toxic spill out there on I-80, the Darrow men wouldn't have been required for the job. I mean, if it was just a spill, what would there have been to see except maybe an overturned truck and a damaged, leaking canister of gas or liquid. Turning their attention once more to the newspapers spread before them, they found additional evidence indicating the Army had had at least some warning that unusual and spectacular trouble would erupt in western Elko County that hot July night. Both Dom and Ginger distinctly remember that the Tranquility Grill had been filled with a strange sound and shaken by earthquake-like tremors about half an hour after full darkness had settled on the land. And because sunset came later during the summer, parentheses, even at 41 degrees north latitude, close parentheses, the trouble must have started approximately at 8:10. Their memory blocks began at the same time, which further pinpointed the event. Yet, Dom spotted a line in one of the Sentinel's stories stating that the roadblocks on I-80 had been erected almost at 8 o'clock on the dot. Ginger said, "You mean the Army had the highway closed off 5 or 10 minutes before the accidental toxic spill even happened?" "Yeah, unless we're wrong about the time of the sunset." They checked the weather column in the July 6th edition of the Sentinel. It painted a more than adequate portrait of that fateful day. The high temperature had been expected to hit 90 degrees, with an overnight low of 64, humidity between 20 and 25%, clear skies, light to variable winds, and sunset at 7:31. "Twilight's short out here," Dom said, 15 minutes tops. Figure full darkness at 7:45. Now, even if we're wrong to think it was half an hour after nightfall that trouble hit, even if it came just 15 minutes after dark, the Army still had its roadblocks up first. So they knew it was coming, Ginger said. But they couldn't stop it from happening. Which means it must have been some process, some series of events that they initiated and then were unable to control. "Maybe," Dom said, "but maybe not. Maybe they weren't really at fault. Until we know more, we're just speculating. No point to it." Ginger turned the page of Sentinel's edition for Wednesday, July 11, which they were currently examining, and her gasp of surprise directed Dom's attention to a head and shoulders photograph of a man in an Army officer's uniform and cap. Although Colonel Leland Falkirk had appeared in neither Dom's nor Ginger's dreams last night, they both recognized him at once because of the description that Ernie and Ned had supplied from their nightmares. Dark hair graying at the temples, eyes with an eerie translucency, a beakish nose, thin lips, a face of flat, hard planes and sharp angles. Dom read the caption under the picture. "Colonel Leland Falkirk, commanding officer for the company of Darrow troops manning the quarantine line, has been an elusive target for reporters." This first photograph was obtained by Sentinel photographer Greg Lund. Caught by surprise, Falkirk was angry about being photographed. His answers to the few questions asked of him were even shorter than the standard no comment. Dom might have smiled at the quiet humor in the last sentence of the caption, but Falkirk's stony visage chilled him. He instantly recognized the face not only because of Ernie's and Ned's description, but because he had seen it before the summer before last. Furthermore, there was a ferocity in that hawk-like countenance, and in those predatory eyes that was dismaying. This man routinely got what he wanted. To be at his mercy was a frightening prospect. Staring at the photograph of Falkirk, Ginger softly said, "Keen in horror." Aware of Dom's puzzlement, she said, "That's Yiddish too. Keen in horror. It's an expression that's used to ward off the evil eye." Somehow it seemed appropriate. Dom studied the photograph, half mesmerized by it. After a moment he said, "Yes, quite appropriate." Colonel Falkirk's sharply chiseled face and cold, pale eyes were so striking that it seemed as if he were alive within this photograph, as if he were returning their scrutiny. While Dom and Ginger were examining the back issue files at the Elko Sentinel, Ernie and Faye Block were working in the office of the Tranquility Motel, trying to contact the people whose names were on the guest list for July 6, 2 summers ago, but who had thus far been unreachable. They were behind the check-in counter, sitting opposite each other at the oak desk, which had knee holes on both sides. A pot of coffee stood within reach on an electric warming plate. Ernie composed a telegram to Gerald Salko, the man who had rented 2 rooms for his family on July 6, the summer before last, and who was unreachable by phone because his number in Monterey, California was unlisted. Meanwhile, Faye went back through last year's guest book day by day, looking for the most recent entry for Cal Sharkle, the trucker who had stayed with them on that July 6th. Yesterday, Dom had tried the telephone number Cal had printed in the guest registry that night, but it had been disconnected. The hope was that a more recent entry would provide his new address and phone number. As they performed their separate tasks, Ernie was reminded of countless other times throughout their 31 years of marriage when they had sat facing each other at a desk or, more often, at a kitchen table. In one apartment or another, in one house or another, at one end of the world or another, from Quantico to Pendleton to Singapore, nearly everywhere the Marines sent him. The two of them had spent long evenings at a kitchen table, working or dreaming or worrying or happily planning together, often late into the night. Ernie was suddenly filled with poignant echoes of those thousands of huddled conferences and shared labors. How very fortunate he had been to find and marry Faye. Their lives were so inextricably linked that they might as well have been a single creature. If Colonel Falkirk or others resorted to murder to terminate this investigation, if anything happened to Faye, then Ernie hoped he would die too, simultaneously. He finished composing the telegram to Gerald Salko, called it into Western Union, and requested immediate delivery, all the while warmed by a love that was strong enough to make their dangerous situation seem less threatening than it really was. Faye found 5 occasions during the past year when Cal Sharkle had stayed overnight, and in every case he had listed the same Evanston, Illinois address and phone number that he had entered in the registry for July 6 of the previous year. Apparently he had not moved after all. Yet when they dialed this number, they obtained the recording that Dom had gotten yesterday, informing them that the telephone had been disconnected and that no new Evanston listing existed. On the chance that Cal had moved out of Evanston into the Windy City itself, Faye dialed area code 312 information and asked if there was a number for Calvin Sharkle in Chicago. There was not. Using a map of Illinois, she and Ernie placed calls to information in the Chicago suburbs: Whiting, Hammond, Calumet City, Markham, Downers Grove, Oak Park, Oak Brook, Elmhurst, Plains, Rolling Meadows, Arlington Heights, Skokie, Wilmette, Glencoe. No luck. Either Cal Sharkle had moved out of the Chicago area or had dropped off the face of the earth. While Faye and Ernie worked in the first floor office, Ned and Sandy Sarver were already preparing dinner in the kitchen upstairs. This evening, after Brendan Cronin arrived from Chicago, after Georgia Monatella and her little girl flew in from Vegas, there would be 9 for dinner, and Ned did not want to leave preparations until the last minute. Yesterday, when all 6 of them joined forces to prepare and serve the evening meal, Ginger Weiss had observed that the occasion was almost like a family holiday gathering, and indeed they felt an extraordinary closeness, though they hardly knew one another, with the idea that reinforcement of their special affection and camaraderie might give them strength to face whatever lay ahead of them. Ned and Sandy had decided that tonight's meal ought to be like a Thanksgiving feast. Therefore, they were preparing a 16-pound turkey, pecan stuffing, scalloped potatoes, baked corn, carrots with tarragon, pepper slab, pumpkin pie, and made-from-scratch crescent rolls. As they chopped celery, diced onions, cubed bread, and grated cabbage, Ned occasionally wondered if what they were cooking was not only a family feast, but also the last hearty meal of the condemned. Each time that morbid thought rose, he chased it away by pausing to watch Sandy as she worked. She smiled almost constantly and sometimes softly hummed a song. Surely an event that had induced this radical and wonderful change in Sandy could not ultimately culminate in their deaths. Surely they had nothing to worry about. Surely. After 3 hours at the Elko Sentinel, Ginger and Dom ate a light lunch, chef salads at a restaurant on Idaho Street, then returned to the Tranquility Motel at 2:30. Faye and Ernie were still in the office, which was filled with appetizing aromas drifting down from the apartment upstairs. Pumpkin, cinnamon, nutmeg, onions fried lightly in butter, and the yeasty odor of baking bread dough. "And you can't smell the turkey yet," Faye said. "Ned just put that in the oven half an hour ago." "He says dinner's at 8, Ernie told them, "but I suspect the odors will drive us mad and force us to storm the kitchen before then." Faye said, "Learn anything at the Sentinel?" Before Ginger could tell them what she and Dom had uncovered, the front door of the motel office opened and a slightly pudgy man entered in a burst of cold, whirling wind. He had hurried from his car without bothering to put on a top coat. Although he wore gray slacks, a dark blue blazer, a light blue sweater, and an ordinary white shirt, rather than a black suit and Roman collar, his identity was not for a moment in doubt. He was the auburn-haired, green-eyed, round-faced young priest in the Polaroid snapshot that the unknown correspondent had sent to Dom. "Father Cronin," Ginger said. She was as immediately and powerfully drawn to him as she'd been to Dominic Corvasis. With the priest, as with Dom, Ginger sensed a shared experience even more shattering than the one which she had shared with the Blocks and Sarvers. Within the event that they had all witnessed that Friday in July, there had been a second event experienced by only some of them. Although it was a frightfully improper way to greet a man who was a virtual stranger and a priest, Ginger rushed to Father Cronin and threw her arms around him. But apologies were not required, for Father Cronin evidently sensed the same thing she did. Without hesitation, he returned her hug, and for a moment they clung to each other, not as if they were strangers, but brother and sister greeting each other after a long separation. Then Ginger stepped back as Dom said Father Cronin and came forward to embrace the priest. "There is no need to call me Father. At the moment I neither want nor deserve to be considered a priest. Please just call me Brendan." Ernie shouted upstairs to Ned and Sandy, then followed Faye out from behind the check-in counter. Brendan shook Ernie's hand and embraced Faye, obviously feeling great affection for them, though not a closeness as powerful and inexplicable as the tremendous emotional magnetism that pulled him toward Dom and Ginger. When Ned and Sandy came downstairs, he greeted them the same as he had Ernie and Faye. Just as Ginger had done last night, Brendan said, "I have a truly wonderful sense of being among family. You all feel it, don't you? As if we'd shared the most important moments of our lives. Went through something that'll always make us different from everyone else." In spite of his insistence that he did not deserve the deference accorded a priest, Brendan Cronin had a profoundly spiritual air about him. His somewhat pudgy face, sparkling eyes, and broad, warm smile conveyed joy, and he moved among them, touched them, and spoke with an ebullience that was infectious, and that somehow lifted Ginger's soul. Brendan said, "What I feel in this room only reassures me that I've made the right decision in coming. I'm meant to be with you. Something will happen here that'll transform us, that's already begun to transform us. Do you feel it? Do you feel it? The priest's soft voice sent a pleasant shiver up Ginger's spine, filled her with an indescribable sense of wonder, reminiscent of what she'd felt the first time that, as a medical student, she had stood in an operating room and had seen a patient's thorax held open by surgical retractors to reveal the pulsing, mysterious complexity of the human heart in all its crimson grandeur. "Called," Brendan said. The softly spoken word echoed eerily around the room. All of us called back to this place. "Look," Dom said, packing a paragraph of amazement into that one syllable, raising his arms and holding his hands out to show them the red rings of swollen flesh that had appeared in his palms. Surprised, Brendan raised his hands, which were also branded by the strange stigmata. As the men faced each other, the air thickened with unknown power. Yesterday on the telephone, Father Wakasik had told Dom that Brendan was relatively certain no religious element was involved in the miraculous cures and other events that had recently transformed the young priest's life. Yet the motel office seemed to Ginger to be filled with a force that, if not supernatural, was certainly beyond the ken of any man or woman. "Called," Brendan said again. Ginger was gripped by breathless expectancy. She looked at Ernie, who stood behind Faye with his hands on her shoulders, and both their faces were full of tremulous suspense. Ned and Sandy, who were by the rack of postcards holding hands, were wide-eyed. Ginger felt the flesh prickling on the back of her neck. She thought, something's going to happen, and even as the thought took form, something did. Every lamp in the motel office was aglow in deference to Ernie's uneasiness in the presence of deep shadows. But abruptly, the place was even brighter than it had been. A milky white light filled the room, springing magically from molecules of air. It shimmered on all sides, but rained mostly from overhead, a silvery mist of luminosity. She realized this was the same light that featured in her unremembered lunar dreams. She turned in a circle, looking around and up through spangled curtains of brilliant yet soft radiance, not in search of the source, but with the hope of remembering her dreams and, ultimately, the events of that long-lost summer night that had inspired the dreams. Ginger saw Sandy reach into the glowing air with one hand as if to grasp a fistful of their miraculous light. A tentative smile pulled at Ned's mouth. Faye smiled too, and Ernie's expression of childlike wonder was almost laughably out of place on his ruggedly hewn face. "The moon," Ernie said. "The moon," Dom echoed, the stigmata still blazing on his hands. For one thrilling moment, Ginger Weiss was poised on the brink of complete understanding. The black, blank membrane of her memory block trembled. Revelation pressed strenuously against the far side, and that membrane seemed certain to split and spill forth everything that had been damned beyond it. Then the light changed from moon white to blood red, and with it the mood changed from wonder and growing delight to fear. She no longer sought revelation, but dreaded it, no longer welcomed understanding, but withdrew from it in terror and revulsion. Ginger stumbled back through the bloody glow, bumped against the front door. Across the room beyond Dom and Brendan, Sandy Sarver had ceased reaching up to seize a handful of light. She was holding tightly to Ned, whose smile had become a rictus of repulsion. Faye and Ernie were pressing back against the check-in counter. As scarlet incandescence welled like fluid into the room and filled it from corner to corner, the stunning visual phenomena were augmented by sound. Ginger jumped in surprise as a loud three-part crash shook the sanguineous air, jumped once more as it repeated, then flinched but did not jump when it came again. It had a cardiac quality, like the thunderous beating of a great heart, though it featured one more stroke than a usual heartbeat. Lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub. She knew at once that it was the apparitional noise of which Father Wyckoff had spoken in his telephone conversation with Dom, the noise that had arisen in Brendan Cronin's bedroom and had shaken St. Bernadette's. But she also knew that she had heard this very thing before. This entire display, the moonlike light, the blood-red radiance, the noise, was part of something that had happened the summer before last. Lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub. The window frames rattled, the walls shook. The bloody light and the lamplight began to pulse in time with the pounding. Lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub. Again, Ginger was approaching a shocking recollection. With each crash of sound and throb of light, long-buried memories surged nearer. However, her inhibiting fear grew. A towering black wave of terror bore down on her. The Azrael block was doing what it was designed to do. Rather than let remembrance have its way with her, she would plunge into a fugue state as she had not done since the day Pablo Jackson had been killed 1 week ago. The familiar signs of oncoming blackout were present. She was having difficulty breathing. She trembled with a sense of mortal danger so strong it was palpable. The world around her began to fade. An oily darkness seeped in at the edges of her vision. Run or die. Ginger turned her back on the phenomenal events transpiring in the office. With both hands, she gripped the frame of the front door as if to anchor herself to consciousness and thwart the black wave that sought to sweep her away. In desperation, she looked through the glass at the vast Nevada landscape, at the somber winter sky, trying to block out the stimuli, the impossible light and sound that pushed her toward a dark fugue. Terror and mindless panic grew so unbearable that escape into a hateful fugue seemed almost preferable. Yet she somehow held fast to the doorframe, held tight, held on, shaking and gasping, held on, terrified not so much by the strange events occurring behind her, but by the unremembered events of that summer, of which these phenomena were only dim echoes, and still she held on, until the three-stroke thunder faded, until the red light paled, until the room was silent, and until the only light that was coming through the windows was from ordinary lighting fixtures. She was all right now. She was not going to black out. For the first time, she had successfully resisted a seizure. Maybe her ordeal of the past few months had toughened her. Maybe just being here, within reach of all the answers to the mystery, had given her the heart to resist. Or maybe she had drawn strength from her new family. Whatever the reason, she was confident that, having once fended off a fugue, she would find it easier to deal with future attacks. Her memory blocks were crumbling, and her fear of facing up to what had happened that July 6th was now far outweighed by the fear of never knowing. Shaky, Ginger turned toward the others again. Brendan Cronin tottered to the sofa and sat, trembling visibly. The rings were no longer visible in either his hands or Dom's. To the priest, Ernie said, "Did I understand you? That same light sometimes fills your room at night?" "Yes," Brendan acknowledged, "twice before." "But you told us it was a lovely light," Faye said. "Yeah," Ned agreed. "You made it sound wonderful." "It is," Brendan said. "Partly it is. But when it turns red, well, then it scares the hell out of me. But when it first starts, oh, it uplifts me and fills me with the strangest joy." The ominous scarlet light and the frightening three-part hammering had generated such terror in Ginger that she had temporarily forgotten the exhilarating moon-white glow that had preceded it and that had filled her with wonder. Wiping his palms on his shirt as if the vanished rings had left an unwanted residue upon his hands, Dom said, "There was both a good and evil aspect to the events of that night. We long to relive a part of what happened to us, yet at the same time it scares us. Scares us. Scares us shitless, Ernie said. Ginger noticed that even Sandy Sarver, who heretofore had perceived only a benign shape to the mystery, was frowning. When Georgia Monatella buried her ex-husband, Alan Rykoff, at 11 o'clock Monday morning, the Las Vegas sun beamed down between scattered iron-gray clouds. 100 shafts of golden sunshine, some half a mile across, some only a few yards wide, like cosmic spotlights, left many buildings in winter shadows, while highlighting others. Several shafts of sunshine moved across the cemetery, harried by the rushing clouds, sweeping eastward across the barren floor of the desert. As the portly funeral director concluded a non-denominational prayer, as the casket was lowered into the waiting grave, a particularly bright beam illuminated the scene, and color burst from the flowers. In addition to Georgia and Paul Rykoff, Alan's father, who had flown in from Florida, only 5 people had shown up. Even Georgia's parents had not come. By his selfishness, Alan had assured an exit from life accompanied by a minimum of grieving. Paul Rykoff, too, like his son in some respects, blamed Georgia for everything. He had been barely civil since his arrival yesterday. Now that his only child was on the ground, he turned from Georgia, stone-faced, and she knew she would meet him again only if his stubbornness and anger eventually were outweighed by a desire to see his grandchild. She drove only a mile before she pulled to the side of the road, stopped, and finally wept. She wept neither for Alan's suffering nor for the loss of him, but for the final destruction of all the hope with which their relationship had begun, the burnt-out hopes for love, family, friendship, mutual goals, and shared lives. She had not wished Alan dead, but now that he was dead, she knew it would be easier to make the new beginning toward which she had been planning and working, and that realization made her feel neither guilty nor cruel. It was just sad. Last night, Georgia told Marcy her father was dead, though not that he committed suicide. Initially, Georgia had not intended to tell her until this afternoon, in the presence of Dr. Coverly, the psychologist, but the appointment with Coverly had to be canceled because later today, Georgia and Marcy were flying to Elko to join Dominic Corvasis, Ginger Weiss, and the others. Marcy took the news of Alan's death surprisingly well. She cried, but not hard or long. At 7, she was old enough to understand death, but still too young to grasp the cruel finality of it. Besides, by his abandonment of Marcy, Alan unwittingly had done the girl a favor. In a sense, for her, he had died more than a year ago, and her mourning had already been done. One other thing that helped Marcy overcome her grief, her obsession with the collection of moon pictures. Only an hour after she learned of her father's death, the child was sitting at the dining room table, eyes dry, small pink tongue poked between her teeth in total concentration, a crayon stub in one hand. She'd begun the moon coloring project on Friday evening and pursued it through the weekend. By breakfast this morning, every one of the photographs and all but 50 of the hundreds of hand-drawn moons had been transformed into fiery globes. Marcy's obsession would have disturbed Georgia even if she had not known others shared it, and that 2 had killed themselves. The moon was not yet the focus of the girl's every waking hour. However, Georgia required little imagination to see that if the obsession progressed, Marcy might travel irretrievably into the land of madness. Her anxiety about Marcy was so acute that she quickly overcame the tears that had forced her to pull to the side of the road. She put the Chevette in gear and drove to her parents' house where Marcy waited. The girl was at the kitchen table with the ubiquitous album of moons, applying a scarlet crayon. She glanced up when Georgia arrived, smiled weakly, and returned at once to the task before her. Pete, George's father, was also at the table, frowning at Marcy. Occasionally he thought of a stratagem to interest her in some activity less bizarre and more wholesome than the endless coloring of moons, but all his attempts to lure her away from the album failed. In her parents' bedroom, Georgia changed from her dress into jeans and a sweater for the trip north, while Mary Monticello badgered her. "When will you take that book away from Marcy, or let me take it away?" "Mother, I told you before, Dr. Coverly believes taking the book from her right now would only reinforce her obsession." "That doesn't make any sense to me," George's mother said. "Dr. Coverly says if we make an issue of the Moon collection at this early stage, we will be emphasizing its importance and..." "Nonsense. Does this Coverly have kids of his own?" "I don't know, Mom." "I'll bet he doesn't have kids of his own. If he did, he wouldn't be giving you such dumb advice." Having put her dress on a hanger, having stripped down to brown panties, Georgia felt naked and vulnerable, for this situation reminded her of when her mother used to watch her dress for dates with boys who did not meet approval. No boy ever met Mary's approval. In fact, Georgia married Alan in part because Mary disapproved of him. Matrimony is rebellion. Stupid, but she had done it and paid dearly. Mary had driven her to it, Mary's suffocating and authoritarian brand of love. Now, Georgia grabbed the jeans that were laid out on the bed and slipped into them, dressing fast. Mary said she won't even say why she's collecting those things. Because she doesn't know why. It's a compulsion, an irrational obsession, and if there's a reason for it, the reason is buried down in her subconscious, where even she can't get a look at it. Mary said that book should be taken away from her. "Eventually," Georgia said, "one step at a time, Mom. If it was up to me, I'd do it right now." Georgia had packed 2 big suitcases and had left them here earlier. Now, when it was time to go to the airport, Pete drove and Mary went along for the opportunity to engage in more nagging. Georgia and Marcy shared the back seat. On the way to the airport, the girl paged continuously, silently back and forth through her album. Between Georgia and Mary, the subject of conversation had changed from the best way to deal with Marcy's obsession to the imminent trip to Elko. Mary had doubts about this expedition and did not hesitate to express them. Was the plane just a 12-seater? Wasn't it dangerous to go up in a bucket of bolts owned by a small-time outfit that was probably short of cash and skimped on maintenance? What was the purpose of going anyway? Even if some people in Elko were having problems like Marcy's, how could it possibly have anything to do with the fact that they'd all stayed at the same motel? "This Corvasis guy bothers me," Pete said as he braked for a red traffic light. "I don't like you getting involved with his kind." "What do you mean you don't even know him?" "I know enough," Pete said. "He's a writer, and you know what they're like. I read once that Norman Mailer hung his wife out a high window by her heels. And isn't it Hemingway who's always getting in fistfights?" Georgia said, "Daddy, Hemingway's dead." "See? Always getting in fights, drunk, using drugs. Writers are a flaky bunch. I don't like you being involved with writers." "This trip is a big mistake," Mary said flatly. It never ended. At the airport, when she kissed them goodbye, they told her they loved her and she told them the same, and the strange thing was that they were all telling the truth. Though they continuously sniped at her, and though she had been deeply wounded by their sniping, they loved one another. Without love, they would have stopped speaking long ago. The parent-child relationship was sometimes even more perplexing than the mystery of what had happened at the Tranquility Motel 2 summers ago. The feeder line's bucket of bolts was more comfortable than Mary would have believed, with 6 well-padded seats on each side of a narrow aisle, free headphones providing bland but mellowing music tapes, and a pilot who handled his craft as gently as a new mother carried her baby. 30 minutes out of Las Vegas, Marcy closed the album, and, in spite of the daylight streaming through the portholes, she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the loud but hypnotic droning of the engines. During the flight, Georgia thought about her future, the business degree toward which she was working, her hope of owning a dress shop, the hard work ahead, and loneliness, which was already a problem for her. She wanted a man, not sexually, although that would be welcome too. She had dated a few times since the divorce, but had been to bed with no one. She was no female eunuch. Sex was important to her, and she missed it. But sex was not the main reason she wanted a man, one special man, a mate. She needed someone to share her dreams, triumphs, and failures. She had Marcy, but that was not the same. The human species seemed genetically compelled to make life's journey 2 by 2, and the need was particularly strong in Georgia. As the plane droned north-northeast, Georgia listened to Mantovani on the headphones and indulged in a bit of uncharacteristic girlish fantasizing. At the Tranquility Motel, perhaps she would meet a special man with whom she could share this new beginning. She recalled Dominic Corvase's gentle but confident voice and included him in her fantasy. If Corvasis was the one for her, imagine what her father would say when he learned she was marrying one of those flaky, drunken writers who held their wives by the heels and dangled them out high windows. She scrapped that particular fantasy soon after the plane landed, for she quickly perceived that Corvasis's heart was already claimed. At 4:30 in Elko, half an hour before sunset, the sky was plated with dark clouds, and the Ruby Mountains were purple-black on the horizon. A penetratingly cold wind sweeping in from the west was ample proof that they had come 400 miles north from Las Vegas. Corvasis and Dr. Ginger Weiss were waiting on the tarmac beside the small terminal, and the moment that Georgia saw them, she had the odd but reassuring feeling that she was among family. That sensation was something of which Corvasis had spoken on the phone, but Georgia had not understood what he meant until she experienced it. And it was quite separate from the feeling she had for Ginger as her roadside savior. Even Marcy, bundled in coat and scarf, her eyes still puffy from the nap on the plane, the album clutched to her chest, was stirred from her moody, trance-like state by the sight of the writer and the physician. She smiled and answered their questions with more enthusiasm than had marked her speech in days. She offered to show them her album, and she submitted with a giggle when Corvasis scooped her up in his arms to carry her to the parking lot. We were right to come, Georgia thought. Thank God we did. Carrying Marcy, Corvasis led the way to the car, while Georgia and Ginger followed with the suitcases. As they walked, Georgia said, "Maybe you don't remember, but you provided emergency treatment for Marcy that Friday evening in July, even before we checked into the Tranquility." The physician blinked. "In fact, I hadn't remembered. Was that you and your late husband? Was that Marcy?" "But of course it was." We had parked along I-80 5 miles west of the motel, Georgia recalled. The view to the south was so spectacular, such a wonderful panorama, that we wanted to use it as a backdrop for some snapshots. Ginger nodded. "And I was driving east in your wake. I saw you up ahead, parked along the shoulder. You were focusing the camera. Your husband and Marcy had stepped over the guardrail and were standing a few feet farther out, posing at the edge of the highway embankment. I didn't want them standing so close to the brink, but Ellen insisted it was the best position for the best picture, and when Ellen insisted on something, there was no use arguing with him." However, before Georgia had been able to click the shutter, Marcy had slipped and fallen backward over the edge, tumbling down the 30 or 40-foot embankment. Georgia screamed, "Marcy!" flung the camera aside, vaulted the guardrail, and started down toward her daughter. Fast as she was, however, Georgia had just reached Marcy when she heard someone shouting, "Don't move her! I'm a doctor!" That had been Ginger Weiss, and she had descended the slope so rapidly that she had arrived at Marcy's side simultaneously with Ellen, who had started down before her. Marcy was still and silent, but not unconscious, only stunned, and Ginger quickly determined that the girl had not sustained a head injury. Marcy began to cry, and because her left leg was tucked under her at a somewhat odd angle, Georgia was certain it was broken. Ginger was able to allay that fear too. In the end, because the slope was rock-free and cushioned by bunch grass, Marcy came through with only minor injuries, a few scrapes and bruises. "I was so impressed by you," Georgia said. "Me?" Ginger looked surprised. She waited for an incoming single-engine plane to pass overhead. Then, "I did nothing special, you know. I only examined Marcy. She didn't need heroic care, just Band-Aids." As they put the suitcases in the trunk of Dom's car, Georgia said, "Well, I was impressed. You were young, pretty, feminine, yet you were a doctor, efficient, quick-thinking. I'd always thought of myself as a born cocktail waitress, nothing more. But that encounter with you started a fire in me. Later, when Alan walked out on us, I didn't fall apart. I remembered you, and I decided to make more of myself than I'd ever thought I could. In a way, you changed my life." Closing the trunk lid, locking it, handing the keys to Dom, who had already put Marcy in the car, Ginger said, "Georgia, I'm flattered, but you're giving me much too much credit. You changed your own life." "It wasn't what you did that day," Georgia said. "It's what you were. You were exactly the role model I needed." Embarrassed, the physician said, "Good God, no one's ever called me a role model before." "Oh, honey, you're definitely unbalanced." "Ignore her," Dom told Georgia. "She's the best role model I've ever seen. Her humble mutterings are poor schmancies." Ginger Weiss whirled on him, laughing. "Schmancies?" Dom grinned. "I'm a writer, so it's my job to listen and absorb. I hear a good expression, I use it. Can't fault me for doing my job." "Schmancies, huh?" Ginger Weiss said, pretending anger. Still grinning, the writer said, "If the Yiddish fits, wear it." That was the moment when Georgia knew Dominic Corvase's heart was already claimed, and that she would have to exclude him from any romantic fantasy she might cook up in the future. The spark of desire and glimmer of deep affection shone brightly in his eyes when he looked at Ginger Weiss. The same heat warmed the physician's gaze. The funny thing was, neither Dom nor Ginger appeared quite to realize the true power of their feelings for each other. Not quite yet, but soon. They drove out of Elko toward the Tranquility, 30 miles to the west. As twilight faded toward night in the east, Dom and Ginger told Georgia what had happened prior to her and Marcy's arrival. Georgia found it increasingly difficult to hold the good mood she'd been in since stepping off the plane. As they sped through the gloom-mantled barrens with craggy and threatening black mountains thrusting up at the horizon under a blood-dark sky, Georgia wondered if this place was, as she had thought, the threshold of a new beginning, or a doorway to the grave. After the Lear landed in Salt Lake City, Utah, Jack Twist quickly transferred to a chartered Cessna Turbo Skylane RG, piloted by a polite but tight-lipped man with a huge handlebar mustache. They arrived in Elko, Nevada at 4:53 in the last light of day. The airport was too small to have Hertz and Avis counters, but a local entrepreneur operated a modest little taxi company. Jack had the cab take him and his 3 big suitcases to a local Jeep dealership where they were getting ready to close, and where he startled the salesman by paying cash for a 4-wheel drive Cherokee wagon. To this point, Jack took no evasive action to shake off a tail or even to determine if he had one. His adversaries clearly possessed great power and resources, and regardless of how frantically he tried to elude them, they would have sufficient manpower to keep tabs on a lone target trying to escape on foot or by taxi in a town as small as Elko. Once the Cherokee was his, Jack drove away from the dealership, and for the first time he looked for a tail. He glanced repeatedly at the rearview and side mirrors, but he spotted no suspicious vehicles. He went directly to an Arco Mini-Mart that he had noticed during the taxi ride from the airport. He parked at the dark end of the lot beyond the reach of the arc lamps, got out of the wagon, and surveyed the shadowy street behind for an indication of a pursuer. He saw no one. That didn't mean they weren't out there. In the mini-mart, the blindingly excessive fluorescent lighting and chrome display fixtures made him long for the good old days of quaint corner groceries operated by immigrant couples who spoke with appealing accents, where the air would have been redolent of Mama's homemade baked goods and Papa's made-to-order deli sandwiches. Here, the only aromas were a vague trace of disinfectant and the thin odor of ozone coming off the motors of refrigerated display cases. Squinting in the glare, Jack bought a map of the county, a flashlight, a quart of milk, 2 packages of dried beef, a little box of small chocolate donuts, and, on a morbid impulse, something called a hamwich, which was, quote, a guaranteed delicious one-piece sandwich of pulverized, blended, remolded ham paste, bread, and spices, end quote, and which was claimed to be especially, quote, convenient for hikers, campers, and sportsmen, end quote. Ham paste? At the bottom of the airtight plastic package was this legend, real meat. Jack laughed. They had to tell you it was real meat because even though it was wrapped in clear plastic, you couldn't tell what the hell it was by looking at it. Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ham paste and real meat. That was why he had gone to Central America to fight for his country. He wished Jenny were alive and here with him, real meat, as opposed to fake polyester meat. She'd have gotten a kick out of that. When he walked out of the mini-mart, he paused to study the street again, but again he saw no one suspicious. He returned to the Cherokee at the dark end of the lot and put up the tailgate. He opened one of his suitcases, withdrew an empty nylon rucksack, the Beretta, a loaded clip, a box of 32 ammunition, and one of the pipe-type silencers. As his breath steamed from him in the cold air, he transferred the groceries from the paper bag to the rucksack. He screwed the silencer onto the gun, slammed the loaded clip into the butt. When he had distributed all the loose ammunition among the many pockets of his heavily insulated leather jacket, he closed the tailgate. Behind the wheel of the Cherokee once more, Jack put the Beretta on the seat beside him and set the rucksack on top of it for concealment. Using the new flashlight, he passed a few minutes studying the map of Elko County. When he switched the flashlight off and put the map away, he was ready to engage the enemy. For the next 5 minutes, he drove through Elko, using every trick he knew to reveal a tale, staying on quiet residential streets where traffic was light and where a surveillance team would be as obvious as a festering cold sore, no matter how good they were. Nothing. He parked at the end of a cul-de-sac and got an anti-surveillance broadband receiver from one of the suitcases. This device, the size of 2 packs of cigarettes with a short antenna that telescoped out of the top, received all possible radio bands from 30 to 120, including FM from 88 to 108. If a transmitter had been fixed to the Jeep while he was in the market, enabling a tail to follow at a distance, his broadband receiver would pick up the signals. A feedback loop would cause the receiver to emit an ear-piercing squeal. He pointed the antenna at the Jeep and slowly circled the vehicle. The Cherokee had not been bugged. He put the broadband receiver away and got behind the wheel of the wagon again, where he sat for a minute and thought. He was under neither visual nor electronic surveillance. Did that make sense? When his adversaries put those Tranquility Motel postcards in his safe deposit boxes, they must have known he would come to Nevada at once. Surely they also knew that he was a potentially dangerous man, and surely they would not allow him to plot against them on their own turf unobserved. Yet that seemed to be precisely what they were doing. Frowning, Jack twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared. On the Lear from New York, he had pondered the situation at length and had arrived at several theories, most of them half-baked, as to the identity and intentions of his adversaries. Now he decided that nothing he dreamed up was half as strange as whatever was actually happening. No one was watching. That spooked him. The inexplicable always spooked him. When you couldn't understand a situation, that usually meant you were missing something important. If you were missing something important, that meant you had a blind side. If you had a blind side, you could get your ass shot off when you were least expecting it. Alert, cautious, Jack Twist drove north from Elko on State Route 51. After a while, he turned west, following a series of gravel and dirt tracks, sneaking behind the Tranquility Motel instead of making an open approach on I-80. Eventually, he was reduced to traveling overland on sometimes dangerous terrain, from an elevation as high as 4,000 feet, down across sloping foothills toward the plains. When the clouds parted, revealing a 3/4 moon, he switched off the headlamps and continued, guided only by the glow of the lunar lamp, and his eyes soon adjusted to the night. Jack topped a rise and saw the Tranquility Motel, a lonely group of lights in a vast, dark emptiness, a mile and a half below and southwest of him, this side of I-80. There were not as many lights as there ought to have been. Either the place had little business or was not open. He did not want to advertise his arrival, so he would proceed on foot. He left the Beretta in the Jeep and took the Uzi submachine gun. Actually, he did not expect trouble, not yet. His adversaries, whoever the hell they were, had not teased him into coming all this way merely to kill him. They could have killed him in New York if that was all they wanted. Nevertheless, he was prepared for violence. In addition to the Uzi and a spare magazine, he took the rucksack of groceries, a battery-powered directional microphone, and the Startron night vision device. He pulled on gloves and a toboggan cap. Jack found the hike invigorating. The night was cold, and when the wind gusted, it stung, but not unpleasantly. Because he'd expected to go to ground immediately upon arrival in Nevada, he had dressed suitably when he left New York. He wore high-top hiking shoes with hard rubber soles and heavy tread, long johns and jeans, a sweater, and a leather jacket with a thick quilted lining. The crew of the chartered Lear was surprised by his appearance, but they treated him as if he were in tuxedo and top hat. Even an ugly man with one cast eye, dressed like an ordinary laborer, elicited respect when he could afford to lease a private jet rather than fly commercial airlines. Now Jack walked. Ragged tears in the clouds disrobed the moon, and the few widely scattered patches of snow shone brightly as if they were shards of bone glimpsed in the darker carcass of the humpback hills. The bare earth, rock formations, sagebrush, and plentiful dry grass accepted the caress of moonlight and were limned in a vague milky blonde hue. But when the moon slipped behind the clouds, deep rich darkness flooded forth. At last he reached a suitable observation post on the southern slope of a hill, only 1/4 mile behind the Tranquility Motel. He sat down, putting the Uzi and his rucksack aside. The Startron night vision device took available light, starlight, moonlight, the natural phosphorescence of snow and of certain plants, meager electric light, if any, and amplified it 85,000 times. With the gadget's single lens, Jack could transform all but the very blackest nights into gray daylight or better. He propped his elbows on his knees, held the Startron in both hands, and focused on the Tranquility. The rear of the structure popped into view with sufficient clarity for him to determine that no lookouts were posted in any shadowed niches. None of the motel units had windows along the back wall, so no guards could be watching from those rooms. The center third of the motel had a second floor, probably the owner's apartment, and light shone at most of those windows. However, he could not see into the apartment because the drapes and blinds were drawn. He put the Startron in the rucksack and picked up the battery-powered handheld directional microphone, which resembled a futuristic gun. Only a few years ago, rifle mics were effective to a distance of only 200 yards, But these days, a good power-amplified unit could suck in a conversation up to a quarter of a mile, much farther if conditions were ideal. The device included a pair of compact earphones which he put on. He aimed the mic at a window shielded by drapes and at once heard animated voices. However, he got only scraps of their conversation because he was trying to pull their voices out of a closed room and through a quarter-mile blustery wind. With great caution, he grabbed the Uzi and other gear and moved closer, choosing a second observation point less than 100 yards from the building. When he aimed the mic at the window again, he picked up every word spoken beyond the glass, in spite of the muffling draperies. He heard 6 voices, maybe more. They were eating dinner and complimenting the cook, someone named Ned, and his helper, Sandy, on the turkey, the pecan stuffing, and other dishes. They're not just eating dinner, Jack thought enviously. They're having a damn banquet in there. He'd eaten a light lunch on the lair, but had taken nothing since. He was still in Eastern Standard Time, so for him it was almost 11 o'clock. He would probably be eavesdropping for hours, piecing together these people's identities, gradually determining if they were his adversaries. He was too hungry to wait that long for his own dinner, such as it was. With a few rocks, he made a brace for the microphone to keep it angled toward the window. He unwrapped the hamwich and bit into that pulverized, blended, and remolded treat. It tasted like sawdust soaked in rancid bacon fat. He spat out the gummy mouthful and settled down to a meager meal of dried beef and donuts, which would have been more satisfying if he had not had to listen to those strangers indulging in a modern version of a harvest feast. Soon Jack had heard enough of the conversation in the apartment to know these people were not his enemies. Strangely, one way or another, they had been drawn or summoned here as he'd been. Monitoring them, he began to think their voices were curiously familiar, and he was overcome with the feeling that he belonged among them as a brother among family. A woman named Ginger and a man, either Don or Dom, began to tell the others about research they'd done earlier in the offices of the Elko Sentinel. Listening to talk of toxic spills, roadblocks, and highly trained Darrow troops, Jack felt his appetite fading. Darrow! Shit, he'd heard about the Darrow companies, though they'd been formed after he left the service. They were gung-ho types who'd happily accept an order to go into a pit against a grizzly bear, armed only with a meat grinder, and they were tough enough to make sausages out of the bear. Forced to choose between a quick, painless suicide and hand-to-hand combat with the Darrow, the ordinary man would be well advised to blow his own brains out and save himself pain. Jack realized he was involved in something far bigger and more dangerous than Fratellanza revenge or any of the other things he had hypothesized during his flight from New York. Although the picture he got from eavesdropping was full of holes, he began to grasp that these people had come together to discover what had happened to them the summer before last, the same weekend Jack had stayed here. They'd made considerable headway in their investigation, and Jack winced as they openly discussed their progress. They were so naive that they thought closed doors and covered windows ensured privacy. He wanted to shout, "Hey, for God's sake, shut up already! If I can hear you, they can hear you." Darrow. That bit of news made him even sicker than the hamwich. In the motel, they continued to chatter, revealing their strategy to the enemy even as they worked it out. And at last, Jack tore off the earphones, frantically grabbed his guns and equipment, and hurried down through the darkness toward the Tranquility Motel. The apartment had no dining room, just the alcove and the kitchen, but that area was too small to seat 9. In the living room, they moved the furniture against the walls, brought in the kitchen table, and used both extra leaves to extend it, accommodating everyone. To Dom, the impromptu arrangements contributed to the feeling of a family gathering and to the mood of cautious festivity. Rather than have to repeat themselves, Dom and Ginger had waited until dinner when the group was gathered to report on their research at the newspaper in Elko. Now, over the clinking of silverware, they revealed that the Army had blockaded I-80 minutes before the toxic spill that Friday night, which meant that choppers full of soldiers had been dispatched from distant Schenkfield at least half an hour earlier, and that the Army knew in advance the quote-unquote accident was going to happen. During a crescent roll, Dom said if Falkirk and a Darrow company flew in and took over security on the quarantine line so soon after the crisis hit, well, it means the Army must have had advance warning. But then why didn't they stop it from happening? Georgia Monatella asked as she cut her daughter's serving of turkey into bite-sized pieces. Apparently they couldn't stop it, Dom said. Maybe there was a terrorist attack on the truck and maybe Army intelligence only got wind of it just before it went down, Ernie said. Maybe, Dom said doubtfully, but they would have gone public with that kind of story if it happened. So it must have been something else. Something involving top-secret data of such importance that only Darrow troops could be trusted to keep quiet about it. Brendan Cronin had a heartier appetite than anyone at the table, but his temporal appetite did not diminish the spiritual air that had surrounded him. He swallowed some baked corn and said, "This explains why there weren't hundreds of people on those 10 miles of interstate when the thing happened, as there should have been at that hour. If the Army sealed it off ahead of the event, they had time to get most traffic out of the danger zone before anything actually happened." Dom said some didn't get out, saw too much, and were held and brainwashed with the rest of us who were already here at the motel. For a while, everyone joined in the discussion and arrived at all the same theories and unanswerable questions that had occurred to Dom and Ginger at the newspaper offices earlier in the day. Finally, Dom told them about the important discovery he and Ginger had made when, as an afterthought, they had looked through issues of the Sentinel published during the weeks following the toxic spill. When they had finished pouring through editions for the week of the crisis, Ginger had suggested that clues to the secret of what really happened on the closed highway that night might be hidden in other news and unusual stories that appeared to have nothing to do with the crisis but were in fact related to it. They pulled more issues from the files, and by studying every story from a paranoid perspective, they soon found what they hoped for. One place in particular figured in the news in such a way that it seemed linked to the closure of I-80. "Thunder Hill," Dom said. "We believe that's where our trouble came from. Schenkfield was just a ruse, a clever misdirection to focus attention away from the real source of the crisis, Thunder Hill." Faye and Ernie looked up from their plates in surprise, and Faye said, "Thunder Hill's 10 or 12 miles north-northeast of here in the mountains. The Army has an installation up there too, the Thunder Hill Depository. There are natural limestone caves in those hills where they store copies of service records and a lot of other important files, so they won't lose all copies if military bases in other parts of the country are wiped out in a disaster, nuclear war like that." Ernie said the depository was here before Faye and me, 20 years or more. Rumors have it that files and records aren't the only things in storage there. Some believe there's also huge supplies of food, medicines, weapons, ammunition, which makes sense. In case a big war breaks out, the Army wouldn't want all its weapons and supplies on ordinary military bases because those would be the first nuked. They've surely got fallback caches, C-A-C-H-E-S, and I guess Thunder Hill is one of those. "Then anything might be up there," Georgia Monatella said uneasily. "Anything," Ned Sarver said. "Is it possible the place isn't just a storage dump?" Sandy asked. Could they also maybe be doing some kind of experiments up there?" "What kind of experiments?" Brendan asked, leaning over to look past Ned, beside whom he was seated. Sandy shrugged. Any kind. It's possible, Dom said. The same thought had occurred to him. But if there wasn't a toxic spill on I-80, if it was something at Thunder Hill that went wrong, Ginger said, how could it have affected us more than 10 miles to the south? No one could think of an answer. Marcy, who had been preoccupied with her moon collection for most of the evening, and who had said nothing during dinner, put down her fork and piped up with a question of her own. Why is it called Thunder Hill? Sweetie, Faye said, that's one I can answer. Thunder Hill's really one of 4 huge connecting mountain meadows, a long sloping piece of high pasture land. It's surrounded by a great many high peaks, and during a storm, the place acts like a sort of funnel for sound. The Indians named it Thunder Hill hundreds of years ago because thunder echoes between those peaks and rolls down the mountainsides, and it all pours in on that one particular meadow in a most peculiar way, so that it seems as if the roar isn't coming out of the sky, but as if it's coming right up out of the ground around you. Wow, Marcy said softly. I'd probably pee my pants. Marcy, Georgia said as everyone broke into laughter. Well, gee, I probably would, the child replied. You remember when Grandma and Grandpa came over to dinner at our place, and there was a big storm, really big, and some lightning struck the tree in our yard, and there was this boom, and I peed my pants? Looking around the table at her new extended family, she said, I was so embarrassed. Everyone laughed again, and Georgia said, that was more than 2 years ago. You're a bigger girl now. To Dom, Ernie said, you haven't told us yet why Thunder Hill is the place rather than Schenkfield. What did you find in the newspaper? In the Sentinel for Friday, July 13, exactly 1 week after the closure of I-80, and 3 days after its reopening, there was a report of 2 county ranchers, Norville Brust and Jake Dirksen, who were having trouble with the Federal Bureau of Land Management. A disagreement between ranchers and the BLM was not unusual. The government owned half of Nevada, not merely deserts, but a lot of the best grazing land, some of which at least to cattlemen for their herds. Ranchers were always complaining that the BLM kept too much good land out of use, that the government ought to sell off part of its holdings to private interests, and that leases were too expensive. But Brust and Dirksen had a new complaint. For years, they leased BLM land surrounding a 300-acre Army installation, the Thunder Hill Depository. Brust held 800 acres to the west and south, and Dirksen was using over 700 acres on the east side of Thunder Hill. Suddenly, on Saturday morning, July 7, though 4 years remained on Brust and Dirksen's leases, the BLM took 500 acres from Brust, 300 from Dirksen, and at the request of the Army, those 800 acres were incorporated into the boundaries of the Thunder Hill Depository, which just happens to be the very morning after the toxic spill and the closure of I-80, Faye observed. Brust and Dirksen showed up Saturday morning to inspect their herds per their usual routine, Dom said, and both discovered that their livestock had been driven off most of the leased pasture. A temporary barbed wire fence was being thrown into place along the new perimeter of the Thunder Hill Depository. Having finished dinner, Ginger pushed her plate aside and said, the BLM simply told Brust and Dirksen it was unilaterally abrogating their leases without compensation, but they didn't receive an official written notice till the following Wednesday, which is extremely unusual. Ordinarily, a notice of termination comes 60 days in advance. Was that kind of treatment legal? Brendan Cronin asked. Right, there's the problem of doing business with the government, Ernie told the priest. You're dealing with the very people who decide what's legal and what isn't. It's like playing poker with God. Faye said the BLM's despised around these parts. No bunch of bureaucrats is more high-handed. That's what we gathered from reading the Sentinel, Dom said. Now, Ginger and I might have figured the Thunder Hill business was just coincidental, that the BLM just happened to go after that land the same time as the crisis on I-80, but the way the government dealt with Brust and Dirksen after the land was seized was so extraordinary it made us suspicious. When the ranchers hired attorneys, when stories about the cancellation of their leases began appearing in the Sentinel, the BLM did a sudden about-face and offered compensation after all. That's not a bit like the BLM, Ernie said. They'll always make you drag them into court, hoping litigation will wear you down. How much were they willing to pay Brust and Dirksen, Faye asked. The figure wasn't revealed, Ginger said, but it was evidently darn good because Brust and Dirksen accepted it overnight. So the BLM bought their silence, Georgia said. I think it was the army working secretly through the BLM, Dom said. They realized the longer the story was in the news, the more chance there was of someone wondering about a link between the crisis on I-80 that Friday night and the unorthodox seizure of land the very next morning, even if the two events were 10 or 12 miles apart. Surprisingly, somebody didn't make the connection, Georgia said. If you and Ginger could spot it this long after the fact, why didn't anyone think of it then? For one thing, Ginger said, Dom and I had the enormous benefit of hindsight. We know there was a lot more going on during the days of the crisis than anyone suspected at the time. So we were specifically looking for connections. But that July, all the hoopla about a toxic spill diverted attention from Thunder Hill. Furthermore, there was nothing extraordinary about ranchers fighting the BLM, so nothing in the situation linked it in anyone's mind with the I-80 quarantine. In fact, when the BLM made that totally out-of-character offer to Brust and Dirksen, a Sentinel editorial praised the repentant attitude of the government and prophesied a new age of reason. But from what you've told us, Dom said to Faye and Ernie, and from what else we've read, that was the first and last time the Bureau of Land Management dealt reasonably with ranchers. So it wasn't a new policy, just a one-time response to a crisis. And it's too coincidental to believe that the crisis evolving at Thunder Hill was unrelated to the crisis simultaneously underway here along the interstate. Besides, Ginger said, once our suspicion was aroused, we got to thinking that if the trouble that night had been related to Schenkfield, there'd have been no need for the army to use Darrow troops for security, because the soldiers stationed at Schenkfield would already have full security clearance in all matters related to that base, and there would have been nothing about a Schenkfield crisis too sensitive for them to see. The only reason Darrow would have been called in is if the crisis was utterly unrelated to Schenkfield, involving something the soldiers at that base were not cleared for. So, if there are answers to our problems, Brendan said, we'll most likely find them at the Thunder Hill Depository. We already suspected the story about a spill was less than half true, Dom said. Maybe there was no truth to it at all. Maybe the crisis had nothing to do with Schenkfield. If the real source was Thunder Hill, the rest was just smoke they blew in the public's eyes. It sure feels right, Ernie said. He had finished dinner, too. His silverware was neatly arranged on the plate, which was almost as clean as before dinner, evidence that his military discipline and order had not departed him. You know, part of my service career was in marine intelligence, so I'm speaking with some experience when I say this Schenkfield staff truly does smack of an elaborate cover story. Ned's frown exaggerated his pronounced widow's peak. There are a couple of things I don't understand. The quarantine didn't extend from Thunder Hill all the way down here. There were miles of territory in between that weren't sealed off. So how did the effects of an accident on Thunder Hill leapfrog over all that distance and come down on our heads without causing trouble between there and here. You're not dull-witted, Dom said. I can't explain it either. Still frowning, Ned said, another thing. The depository doesn't need a lot of land, does it? From what I've heard, it's underground. They've got a couple of big blast doors in the side of the hill, a road leading up to the doors, maybe a guard post, and that's it. The 300 acres you mentioned, the area around the entrance, is plenty big enough for a security zone. So why the land grab? Dom shrugged. Beats me. But whatever the hell happened up there on July 6th, it prompted 2 emergency actions on the part of the Army. First, a temporary quarantine down here, 10 or 12 miles away, until we witnesses could be dealt with. Second, an immediate enlargement of the security zone around the depository, up there in the mountains. A secondary quarantine that's still in effect. I have a hunch, if we're ever going to find out what happened to us, what's still happening, we're going to have to dig into the activities up on Thunder Hill. They were all silent. Though everyone was finished with dinner, no one was ready for dessert. Marcy was using her spoon to draw circles in the greasy residue of turkey gravy on her plate, creating fluid and temporary moon forms. No one moved to clear away the dirty dishes, for at this point in the discussion, no one wanted to miss a word. They were at the crux of their dilemma. How were they to move against enemies as mighty as the U.S. government and army? How were they to penetrate an iron wall of secrecy that had been forged in the name of national security with the full power of the state and the law behind it? We've put together enough to go public, Georgia Monticello said. The deaths of Zebediah Lomack and Allen, the murder of Pablo Jackson, the similar nightmares that many of you have shared, the Polaroids. It's the kind of sensational stuff the media thrives on. If we let the world know what we think happened to us, we'll have the power of the press and public opinion on our side. We won't be alone. No good, Ernie said. That kind of pressure will just make the military stonewall like hell. They'll construct an even more confusing and impenetrable cover-up. They don't crack under pressure the way politicians do. On the other hand, as long as they see us stumbling around on our own, fumbling for explanations, they'll be confident, which might give us time to probe for their weak spots. And don't forget, Ginger warned, apparently Colonel Falkirk advocated killing us instead of just blocking our memories, and we've no reason to believe he's mellowed since then. He was obviously overruled, but if we tried to go public, he might be able to persuade his superiors that a final solution is required after all. But even if it's dangerous, maybe we've got to go public, Sandy said. Maybe Georgia's right. I mean, there's no way we can get inside the Thunderhill Depository to see what's going on. They've got lots of security and a pair of blast doors built to take a nuclear hit. Dom said, well, it's like Ernie told us. We'll have to just stay loose and search for their weaknesses until we find a way. But it looks like they don't have any weaknesses, Sandy said. Their cover-up has been falling apart ever since they brainwashed us and let us go, Ginger said. Each time one of us remembers another detail, that's another gaping hole in their cover-up. Yeah, Ned said, but seems to me they're in a better position to keep patching the holes than we are to keep poking new ones. Let's can the goddamn negative thinking, Ernie said gruffly. Smiling beatifically, Brendan Cronin said, he's right. We must not be negative. We need not be negative because we're meant to win. His voice was again infused with the eerie serenity and certitude which arose from his belief that the revelation of their special fate was inevitable. At moments like this, however, the priest's tone and manner did not comfort Dom as they were meant to, but for some odd reason stirred up a sentiment of fear and muddied his emotions with anxiety. How many men are stationed at Thunderhill? Georgia asked. Before Dom or Ginger could respond with information they gleaned from the sentinel, a stranger appeared in the doorway at the head of the stairs that led up from the motel office. He was in his late 30s, lean and tough-looking, dark-haired, dark-complexioned, with a crooked left eye that was not coordinated with his right. Though the downstairs door was locked, and although the linoleum on the stairs did nothing to quiet ascending footsteps, the intruder appeared with magical silence, as if he were not a real man but an ectoplasmic visitation. "For God's sake, shut up," he said, sounding every bit as real as anyone else in the room. "If you think you can plot in privacy here, you're badly mistaken." 18 miles southwest of the Tranquility Motel at Schenkfield Army Testing Grounds, all the buildings, laboratories, administration offices, security command center, cafeteria, recreation lounge, and living quarters were underground. In the blazing summers on the edge of the high desert and in the occasionally bitter winters, it was easier and more economical to maintain a comfortable temperature and humidity level in underground rooms and in structures erected on the less than hospitable Nevada barrens. But a more important consideration was the frequent open-air testing of chemical and occasionally even biological weapons. The tests were conducted to study the effects of sunlight, wind, and other natural forces on the distribution patterns and potency of those deadly gases, powders, and super-diffusible mists. If the buildings were above ground, any unexpected shift in the wind would contaminate them, making unwilling guinea pigs of base personnel. No matter how involved they became in work or leisure, the staff of Schenkfield never forgot they were beneath the earth, for they had two constant reminders of their condition: the lack of windows, plus the susurration of the piped-in air coming through the wall vents and the echoing hum of the motors that fanned the air along the pipes. Sitting alone at a metal desk in the office to which he had been temporarily assigned, waiting impatiently and worriedly for the phone to ring, Colonel Leland Falkirk thought, "God, I hate this place." The never-ending whine and hiss of the air supply system gave him a headache. Since his arrival on Saturday, Falkirk had been eating aspirin as though they were candy. Now he tipped 2 more out of a small bottle. He poured a glass of ice water from the metal carafe that stood on the desk, but he did not use it to wash down the pills. Instead, he popped the dry aspirin into his mouth and chewed them. The taste was bitter, disgusting, and he almost gagged, but he did not reach for the water. He did not spit out the aspirin either. He persevered. A lonely, miserable childhood filled with uncertainty and pain, followed by an even worse adolescence, had taught Leland Falkirk that life was hard, cruel, and utterly unjust, that only fools believed in hope or salvation, and that only the tough survived. From an early age, he had forced himself to do things that were emotionally, mentally, and physically painful, for he had decided that self-inflicted pain would toughen him and make him less vulnerable. He tempered the steel of his will with challenges that ranged from chewing dry aspirin to major tests like the outings that he called, quote, desperation survival treks, end quote. Those expeditions lasted 2 weeks or longer, and they put him face to face with death. He parachuted into a forest or jungle wilderness, far from the nearest outpost, without supplies, with only the clothes on his back. He carried no compass or matches. His only weapons were his bare hands and what he could fashion with them. The goal: reach civilization alive. He spent many vacations in that self-imposed suffering, which he judged worthwhile because he came back a harder and more self-reliant man than he'd been at the start of each adventure. Now he crunched dry aspirin. The tablets were reduced to powder, and the powder turned his saliva to an acidic paste. "Ring, damn you," he said to the telephone on the desk. He was hoping for news that would get him out of this hole in the ground. In DARO, the Domestic Emergency Response Organization, a colonel was less a desk jockey and more a field officer than in any other branch of the Army. Falkirk's home base was in Grand Junction, Colorado, not Schenkfield. But even in Colorado, he spent little time in his office. He thrived on the physical demands of the job, so the low-ceilinged, windowless rooms of Schenkfield felt like a many-chambered coffin. If he had been engaged upon any mission but this one, he might have established temporary unit headquarters up at Thunderhill Depository. That place was also underground, but its caves were huge, high-ceilinged, not like these tomb-sized rooms. But there were 2 reasons he had to keep his men away from Thunderhill. First, he dared not draw attention to the place because of the secret it harbored. Several ranchers lived in the highlands along the road leading to the gated Thunderhill turnoff. If they spotted a fully equipped Darrow company moving into the depository, they'd speculate about it. Locals must not start wondering about Thunderhill. 2 summers ago, he'd used Schenkfield as a red herring to divert attention from the depository. Now, with another crisis building, he would stay here at Schenkfield again, so he would be in position to spread the same kind of disinformation to the press and public that he'd spread before. The second reason he set up HQ at Schenkfield was because he had certain dark suspicions about everyone in the depository. He trusted none of them, would not feel safe among them. They might be changed. The residue of crushed aspirin had been in his mouth so long that he had adjusted to the bitter taste. He was no longer sickened, no longer had to struggle against the gag reflex, so it was all right to drink the water now. He drained the glass in 4 swallows. Leland Falkirk suddenly wondered if he had crossed the line that separated the constructive use of pain from the enjoyment of it. Even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. Yes, to some degree he had become a masochist. Years ago. He was a very well-disciplined masochist, one who benefited from the pain he inflicted on himself, one who controlled the pain instead of letting it control him, but a masochist nonetheless. At first he subjected himself to pain strictly to make himself tough, but along the way he began to enjoy it too. That insight left him blinking in surprise at the empty water glass. An outrageous image formed in his mind. Himself, more than a decade from now, a 60-year-old pervert sticking bamboo shoots under his fingernails every morning for the thrill and to get his heart running. That grotesque picture was grim. It was also funny, and he laughed. As recently as a year ago, Leland would not have been capable of self-critical insights of this nature. He had never been much of a laugher either, until recently. Lately, he was not merely noticing and being amused by traits in himself that he had never noticed before, but he was also becoming aware that he could and should change some of his attitudes and habits. He saw that he could become a better and more satisfied person without losing the toughness he prized. This was a strange state of mind for him, but he knew the cause of it. After what had happened to him 2 summers ago, after all the things that he had seen, and considering what was happening right now up at Thunderhill, he could not possibly go on with his life exactly as before. The telephone rang. He grabbed it, hoping it was news about the situation in Chicago. But it was Henderson from Monterey, California, reporting that the operation at the Salco house was going smoothly. The summer before last, Gerald Salco, with his wife and 2 daughters, rented a pair of rooms at the Tranquility Motel. On the wrong night. Recently, all the Salcos had experienced marked deterioration of their memory blocks. The CIA's experts in brainwashing, who were usually used only in covert foreign operations, had been borrowed for the Tranquility job that July, and had promised to repress witnesses' memories without fail. Now they were embarrassed by the number of subjects whose conditioning was breaking down. The experience these people had undergone was too profound and shattering to be easily repressed. The forbidden memories possessed mythopoeic power and exerted relentless pressure on the memory blocks. The mind control experts now claim that another 3-day session with the subjects would guarantee their eternal silence. In fact, the FBI and CIA, working in conjunction, were illegally holding the Salco family incommunicado in Monterey at this very moment, putting them through another intricate program of memory repression and alteration. Although Corey Henderson, the FBI agent on the phone, claimed it was going well, Leland decided it was a lost cause. This was one secret that could not be kept. Besides, too many agencies were involved: FBI, CIA, one entire Darrow company, others, which made too many chiefs and not enough Indians. But Leland was a good soldier. In charge of the military side of the operation, he'd carry out his assignment even if it was hopeless. In Monterey, Henderson said, when are you moving in on the other witnesses at the hotel? That was the word they used for everyone who had been brainwashed that July: witnesses. Leland thought it was apt, for in addition to its obvious meaning, it also embodied mystical and religious overtones. He remembered as a child being taken to tent revival at which scores of holy rollers writhed upon the floor, while the raving minister screamed at them to be a witness to the miraculous, be a heartfelt witness for the Lord. Well, what the witnesses at the Tranquility Motel had seen was every bit as paralyzing, amazing, humbling, and terrifying as the face of God that those spasming Pentecostals had longed to see. To Henderson, Leland said, "We're standing by, ready to seal off the motel with half an hour's notice. But I'm not giving the go-ahead until someone straightens out the mess in Chicago with Calvin Sharkle. Not until I know for sure what's going on out in Illinois." What a screw-up. Why was the situation with Sharkle allowed to deteriorate so far? He should have been grabbed, put into a new memory repression program days ago, like we'd done with the Salcos here. "Wasn't my screw-up," Leland said. "Your bureau is in charge of monitoring the witnesses. I only come in and mop up after you." Henderson sighed. "I wasn't trying to shift the blame to your men, Colonel, and hell, you can't blame us either. The trouble is, even though we're only doing visual surveillance of each witness 4 days a month and listening to only about half the tapes of their phone calls, we need 25 agents, but we only have 20. Besides, the damn case is so highly classified that only 3 of the 20 know why the witnesses have to be watched. A good agent doesn't like being kept in the dark like that. Makes him feel he's not trusted, makes him sloppy. So you get a situation like this Sharkle. The witness starts breaking through his memory block, and nobody notices until it's at crisis stage. Why'd we ever think we could maintain such an elaborate deception for an unlimited length of time? Nuts. I'll tell you what our problem was. We believed the CIA's brain scrubbers. We believed those motherfuckers could do what they said they could do. That was our mistake, Colonel." "I always said there was a simpler solution," Leland reminded him. "Kill them all? Kill 31 of our own citizens just because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time?" "I wasn't proposing it seriously. My point was that, short of barbarism, we couldn't contain the secret and shouldn't have tried." Henderson's silence made it clear he did not believe Leland's disclaimer. "Finally, you will move on the hotel tonight? If the Chicago situation clears up, if I can figure what's going on there, we'll move tonight. But there's questions need answers. These strange psychic phenomena, what's it mean? We both have ideas, don't we? And we're scared puke sick. No, sir. I'm not moving against the motel and jeopardizing my men until I understand the situation. Leland hung up. Thunderhill. He wanted to believe that what was happening up in the mountains would lead to a better future than mankind deserved, but in his heart he was afraid it was, instead, the end of the world. When Jack stepped into the living room, which they had converted to a dining room, and spoke to the group, some gasped in surprise and started to rise, bumping the table in their eagerness to turn around, sending up a clatter of dishes and flatware. Others flinched in their chairs as if they thought he had been sent to kill them. He left the Uzi downstairs to avoid causing just such a panic, but his unexpected arrival still scared them. Good. They needed a nasty shock to make them more cautious. Only the little girl playing in her gravy-smeared plate with a spoon did not react to his arrival. "All right, okay, be calm. Sit down, sit," Jack said, gesturing impatiently. "I'm one of you. That night I registered at the motel as Thornton Wainwright, which is how you've probably been looking for me, but that's not my real name. We'll get into that later. For now..." Suddenly everyone was excitedly pitching questions at him. "Where did you... Scared the bejesus... How did you... Tell us if..." Raising his voice enough to silence them, Jack said, "This isn't the place to discuss these things. You can be heard here, for God's sake. I've been eavesdropping for nearly an hour, and if I can listen in on everything you say, then so can the people you're pitted against." They stared dumbly at him, startled by his assertion that their privacy was an illusion. Then a big, blocky man with gray, brush-cut hair said, "Are you telling us these rooms are bugged? 'Cause I find that hard to believe. I mean, I've searched, I've checked, found nothing, and I've had some experience in these matters." "You must be Ernie," Jack said, speaking in a sharp, cold tone of voice meant to keep them on edge and get his message through to them. They had to understand right away that their conversations must be far better guarded, and the lesson had to be driven into them so hard and deep that they would not forget it. "I heard you mention your years in Marine intelligence, Ernie." "Christ, how long ago was that?" "Better part of a decade, I'll bet." "Things have changed since then, man. Haven't you heard about the high-tech revolution? Shit, they don't need to come in here and physically plant listening devices. Rifle mics are a hell of a lot better than they used to be. Or they can just hook up an infinity transmitter to their phone and dial your number." Jack pushed rudely past Ernie and stepped to the living room extension, which stood on a table by the sofa. He put his hand on the phone. "You know what an infinity transmitter is, Ernie? When they dial your number here, an electronic tone oscillator deactivates the bell while it simultaneously opens the microphone in your telephone handset. There's no ringing for you to hear. You've no way of knowing you've been called, that your line's wide open, but they can monitor you in any room where you've got an extension." He plucked up the handset and held it toward them with a calculated look of scorn. "Here's your bug. You had it installed yourself." He slammed the handset back into the cradle. "You can bet your ass they've been tuning in on you a lot lately. Probably listened all through dinner. You people keep this up, you might as well just cut your own throats and save everybody a lot of trouble." Jack's caustic performance had been effective. They were stunned. He said, "Now, is there a room without windows big enough to hold a war council? Doesn't matter if there's a phone, we'll just unplug it." An attractive middle-aged woman, apparently Ernie's wife, whom Jack vaguely remembered from checking into the motel 2 summers ago, thought for a moment and said, "There's the restaurant, the diner next door." "Your restaurant doesn't have any windows?" Jack asked. "They were broken," Ernie said. "Right now they're boarded up." "Then let's go," Jack said. "Let's work out our strategy in privacy, then come back here for some of that pumpkin pie I heard you talking about. I had a lousy dinner while you people were in here eating yourselves into a stupor." Jack went quickly down the stairs, confident they would follow. Ernie loathed the crooked-eyed bastard for 5 minutes, but slowly the hatred turned to grudging respect. For one thing, Ernie admired the caution and stealth with which the guy had answered his own call to the Tranquility Motel. He had not just walked in like the others, he'd even brought a submachine gun. But as he watched Thornton Wainwright slip the carrying strap of the Uzi over one shoulder and head out the front door of the motel office, Ernie was still stung by the criticism he had endured. In fact, his rage was so great, he did not pause to grab a coat, as most of the others did, but plunged after the stranger through the door and across the Macadam toward the diner, keeping pace with him in order to chew him out. Listen, what the hell is the point of being a wise ass? You could have made your point without being so goddamn snide. The stranger said, yeah, but I couldn't have made it as fast. Ernie was about to reply when he abruptly realized he was outside, vulnerable at night in the dark, halfway between the office and the diner. His lungs seemed to collapse. He could not draw the slightest wisp of breath. He made a disgustingly pitiful mewling sound. To Ernie's surprise, the newcomer immediately grasped his arm, providing support with no trace of the scorn he'd shown before. Come on, Ernie, you're halfway there. Lean on me, and you'll make it. Furious with himself for letting this bastard see him disabled and weak with childish fear. Furious with the guy, too, for playing the Samaritan, humiliated, Ernie jerked his arm away from the helping hand. Listen, the newcomer said. While I was eavesdropping, I heard about your problem, Ernie. I don't pity you, and I don't find your condition amusing, okay? If your fear of the dark has something to do with this situation we all find ourselves in, it's not your fault. It's those bastards who messed with us. We need one another if we're going to get through this thing. Lean on me. Let me help you over to the diner where we can turn on some lights. Lean on me. When the newcomer began to talk, Ernie was unable to breathe, but by the time the guy finished his spiel, Ernie had the opposite problem. He was hyperventilating. As though pulled by a magnetic force, he turned from the diner and looked southeast, out into the terrifyingly immense darkness of the Barrens. And suddenly he knew the darkness itself was not what he feared, but something that had been out there on the night of July 6th, that bad summer. He was looking toward that special place along the highway where they had gone yesterday to commune with the land in search of clues. That strange place. Faye had arrived, and Ernie had not shaken loose of her when she had taken hold of him. But now the crooked-eyed man tried to take his arm again, and he was still angry enough to reject that assistance. Okay, the guy said. You're a bullheaded old leather-neck bastard, and it's going to take your hurt pride a while to heal. If you want to be a thick-skulled mule, go ahead, stay pissed at me. It was only your blind anger that got you this far into the dark, wasn't it? Sure as hell wasn't Marine backbone, just dumb blind anger. So if you stay pissed at me, maybe you'll be able to get to the diner. Ernie knew the crooked-eyed man was cleverly taunting him into completing the trip to the Tranquility Grill, that he was not really being cruel. Hate me enough, the guy was saying, and you'll fear the darkness less. Focus on me, Ernie, and take one step at a time. This was not much different than taking the guy's arm and leaning on it, and if Ernie had not been scared half to death by the surging night on all sides of him, he would have been amused at being calm this way. But he held fast to his anger, fanned the flames of it, and used it to light his way to the diner. He stepped through the door after the newcomer and sighed with relief when the lights came on. It's freezing in here, Faye said. She went directly to the thermostat to switch on the oil furnace. Sitting in a chair in the center of the room, his back to the door, Ernie recuperated from his ordeal as the others entered behind him. He watched the crooked-eyed newcomer moving from window to window, checking the plyboard slabs that had been nailed up to replace the shattered glass. And that was when, to Ernie's surprise, he realized he no longer loathed the guy, merely harbored an extreme dislike for him. The newcomer examined the payphone near the door. Being a coin-operated unit, it did not unplug, so he lifted the receiver, tore the cord free of the wall-mounted box, and threw the useless handset aside. "There's a private phone back of the counter," Ned said. The newcomer told him to unplug it, and Ned obliged. Then he told Brendan and Ginger to push 3 tables together and pull up chairs to accommodate everyone, and they did as they were told. Ernie watched the crooked-eyed man with keen interest. The newcomer was concerned about the diner's front door, which had not shattered during the weird phenomenon on Saturday night, because it was made of much thicker glass than the windows had been. It was not boarded up, so it offered a weak point to anyone trying to monitor them with a directional microphone. He wanted to know if any plywood was left from the window job, and Dom told him there was, and he sent Ned and Dom to bring back a suitable piece from the stack in the maintenance room behind the motel. They soon returned with a section of wood that was slightly larger than the door, and the newcomer stood it in front of the glass portal, bracing it in place with the table. "Not perfect," he said, "but good enough to defeat a rifle mic, I think." Then he headed toward the back of the restaurant to have a look in the storeroom, and on his way he told Sandy to plug in the jukebox, switch it to free play, and punch in some songs. Some background noise makes eavesdropping more difficult. Even before he explained why he wanted music, Sandy jumped up and headed for the jukebox, quick to obey him. Abruptly, Ernie realized why the crooked-eyed man fascinated him. The guy's quick thinking, precision movements, and ability to command indicated that he was, or had once been, a career soldier, an officer, a damn good one. He could tune an intimidatingly hard edge into his voice one moment, and the next moment tune it out in favor of cajolery. Hell, Ernie thought he was fascinating because he reminds me of me. That was also why the newcomer had been able to needle Ernie so effectively back in the apartment. The guy knew just where to stick the sharp points because he and Ernie were, in some ways, 2 of a kind. Ernie laughed softly. Sometimes he thought I can be such a perfect jackass. The crooked-eyed man returned from the storeroom and smiled with satisfaction when he saw everyone seated at the long table, which he had told Brendan and Ginger to put together from 3 smaller ones. He came to Ernie and said, "No hard feelings?" "Hell no," Ernie said, "and thanks a lot." The newcomer went to the head of the table where a chair had been left for him. With Kenny Rogers crooning on the jukebox, the guy said, "My name's Jack Twist, and I don't know any more than you what in hell's happening. Probably less than you know. The whole thing gives me the heebie-jeebies, but I also have to tell you this is the first time in 8 years that I've really and truly felt like I'm on the right side of an issue. The first time I felt like one of the good guys, and dear God in heaven, you can't know how much I've needed to feel that." Lieutenant Tom Horner, Colonel Falkirk's aide-de-camp, had enormous hands. The small tape recorder was totally concealed in his right hand when he carried it into the windowless office. His fingers were so large that he seemed certain to have trouble using the little control buttons, but he was remarkably dexterous. He produced the recorder, placed it on the desk, switched it on, and set it in the playback mode. The tape had been duplicated from the reel-to-reel machine in which all phone-monitored conversations were recorded. It was a portion of an exchange that had taken place between several people at the Tranquility only minutes ago. The first part of the tape concerned the witnesses' discovery that the source of their trouble was not Schenkfield but Thunder Hill. Leland listened with dismay. He had not anticipated that their quest would take the right trail so soon. Their cleverness worried and angered him. On the tape, "For God's sake, shut up. If you think you can plot in privacy here, you're badly mistaken." "That's Twist," Lieutenant Horner said. He had a big voice, too, which was as well controlled as his enormous hands. A soft rumble. He stopped the tape. "We knew he was coming here, and we know he's dangerous. We figured he'd be more cautious than the others, sure, but we didn't expect him to act as if he was at war from the get-go." As far as they knew, Jack Twist's memory block had not seriously deteriorated. He was not suffering fugues, sleepwalking phobias, or obsessions. Therefore, only one thing might have motivated him to suddenly lease a plane and fly to Elko County. Mail from the same trader who had sent Polaroids to Corvasis and to the blocks. Leland Falkirk was furious that someone involved in the cover-up, probably someone at Thunderhill, was sabotaging the entire operation. He had made this discovery only last Saturday night when Dominic Corvasis and the blocks had sat at the kitchen table and discussed the strange snapshots they'd been sent. Leland had ordered an immediate investigation and intense screening of everyone at the depository, but that was going a lot slower than he had anticipated. "There's worse," Horner said. He switched on the tape again. Leland listened to Twist tell the others about rifle microphones and infinity transmitters. Shocked, they adjourned to the diner where they could discuss their strategy without being overheard. "They're in the diner now," Horner said, shutting off the recorder. "Ripped out the phones. I've spoken by radio with the observers we have stationed south of I-80. They watch the witnesses move to the grill, but they haven't had any luck tuning in with the rifle mic." "And won't," Leland said sourly. "Twist knows what he's doing." "Now that they're aware of Thunderhill, we've got to move on them as soon as possible. I'm waiting to hear from Chicago." "Sharkle's still barricaded in his house?" "Last I heard, yes," Leland said. "I've got to know if his memory block has completely crumbled. If it has, and if he gets a chance to tell anyone what he saw that summer, then the operation's blown anyway, and it'd be a mistake to move against the witnesses at the motel. We'll have to fall back to another plan." Under the diner's wagon wheel lights, safe in her mother's lap, Marcy dozed off even as Jack Twist introduced himself. In spite of the nap the girl had taken on the plane, sooty, S-O-O-T-Y, rings of weariness encircled her eyes, and a tracery of blue veins marked her porcelain-pale skin. Georgia was tired too, but Twist's dramatic arrival was an effective antidote to the narcotizing effects of the dinner. She was wide awake and eager to hear what he had to tell them of his own tribulations. He began by briefly mentioning his imprisonment in Central America, with which his military career had ended. He made the experience sound more boring and frustrating than frightening, but Georgia sensed that he had endured grueling hardship. From his matter-of-fact tone, she had the impression that he was a man so secure in his self-image, so certain of his emotional and physical and intellectual strengths that he never needed to boast or to hear the praise of others. When he spoke of Jenny, his late wife, he was less able to maintain an air of detachment. Georgia heard the cadences of lingering grief in this part of his story. A river of love and longing flowed beneath his feigned placidity. The intimacy of mind and spirit between Jack Twist and Jenny, prior to her coma, had surely been extraordinary, for only a special and magical relationship would have ensured his unflagging devotion through the woman's long, death-like sleep. Georgia tried to imagine what a marriage of that sort might be like, then realized that regardless of how magical the marriage had been, Jack would not have committed himself so totally to his afflicted wife if he'd been any less than the man he was. Their relationship had been special, yes, but even more special was this man himself. That realization increased George's already strong interest in Twist and his story. He was vague in describing the enterprises by which he had financed Jenny's long stay at a sanitarium. He made it clear only that what he had done was illegal, that he was not proud of it, and that his lawless days were over. "At least I never killed any innocent bystanders, thank God. Otherwise, I think it's best if you don't know any details that might somehow make you accessories after the fact." Their mutual unremembered ordeal had affected Jack Twist, but as with Sandy, the mysterious events of that July night had wrought only beneficial changes in him. Ernie Block said, "I think what you've indirectly told us is that you were a professional thief." When Jack Twist said nothing, Ernie continued, "It occurs to me that you were almost certainly forced to reveal your criminal life to the people who brainwashed us. In fact, from what little you said, I figure those safe deposit boxes in which the postcards turned up were kept under the identities you also used when committing robberies. Therefore, since that July, the Army and government must have known about your illegal activities." Jack's silence was confirmation that he had indeed been a thief. Ernie said, "Yet, once they'd blocked your memories of what really happened here that summer, they turned you loose and let you continue with what you'd been doing. Why in the hell would they do that? I can understand the Army and government bending, even breaking the law to hide whatever happened at Thunder Hill, if it involves national security. But otherwise, you'd expect them to uphold the law, wouldn't you? So why wouldn't they at least anonymously inform the New York police or arrange for you to be caught in the middle of a crime?" Georgia said, "Because from the start, they've not been certain that our memory blocks would hold up. They've been monitoring us, at least checking in on us once in a while to be sure we don't need a refresher course in forgetfulness. What happened to Ginger and Pablo Jackson seems to prove they're watching, all right. And if they decided it was necessary to grab Jack, or any of us, and put him through another session with the mind control doctors, they'd want him where they could reach him without too much trouble. It'd be a lot easier to snatch Jack out of his apartment or from his car than to spirit him out of prison." "Good grief," Jack said, smiling at her. "I think you've hit on it, absolutely." Although Georgia had been slightly chilled by his smile the first time she'd seen it, she perceived it differently now. It was a warmer smile than it had seemed initially. Marcy murmured wordlessly in her sleep. Suddenly and curiously shy about meeting Jack Twist's eyes, Georgia used her daughter's dreamy mutterings as an excuse to look away from him. Jack said, "Whatever secret they're protecting is so important, they had to let me carry on with whatever crimes I chose to commit." Ginger Weiss shook her head. "Maybe not. Maybe they engineered this guilt. Maybe they planted the seeds so you'd change." "No," Jack said. "If they didn't have time to weave the story of the toxic spill into everyone's false memories, they sure wouldn't have had time to finesse me toward the straight and narrow path. Besides, this is difficult to explain, but since coming here tonight, I feel in my heart that I relearned guilt and found my way back into society because something so important happened to us 2 summers ago that it put my own suffering in perspective and made me see that none of my bad experiences was so bad as to justify the warping of my entire life." "Yes," Sandy said, "I feel that too. All the hell I went through as a child, none of it matters after what happened that July." They were silent, trying to imagine what experience could have been so shattering as to make even the most painful of life's tricks seem of little consequence, but none of them could puzzle it out. After he selected more songs on the jukebox, Jack asked a lot of questions of the others, filling the gaps in his knowledge of their various ordeals, and putting together a complete picture of their discoveries to date. That done, he guided them through a discussion of strategy, formulating a set of tasks for tomorrow. Georgia was again intrigued by Jack's leadership skills. By the time the group discussed what steps should be taken next and settled on an agenda, they had agreed to undertake precisely the tasks Jack thought ought to be accomplished, though there was never a sense that he had commanded or manipulated them. When he'd first appeared in the Blacks' apartment, he'd proved he could take control of a situation and, by sheer force of personality, make people obey him. But now he chose indirection, and the speed with which everyone came around to his purposes was proof this was the right tactic. Georgia realized that he impressed her for many of the same reasons that Ginger Weiss had impressed her. She saw in him the kind of person she had been struggling to become ever since her divorce, and the kind of man that Alan could never have been. The final problem the group dealt with was the danger of an attack by Falkirk's men. Now that there was a real chance their memory blocks would substantially decay, or crumble completely in the near future, they posed a greater threat to their enemy than at any time since July, the summer before last. Tomorrow they would be separated most of the day as they carried out their various tasks and researches. But tonight they were in danger if they all stayed at the motel, making one easy target. Therefore, they agreed that most of them would go to bed now, while 2 or 3 drove into Elko and spent part of the night circling through town, always on the move, alert. Assuming that the Tranquility was under observation, the enemy would at once realize they could no longer seize everyone in a clean sweep. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a second group of outriders could rendezvous with the first team in Elko and relieve them so they could come back here and get some sleep. "I'll volunteer for the first team," Jack said. "I just have to fetch my Cherokee from the hills where I left it. Who'll go with me?" "I will," Georgia said at once, then became aware of the weight of her daughter on her lap. That is, if someone will let Marcy sleep in their room tonight." "No problem," Faye said. "She can stay with Ernie and me." Jack said they ought to divide their numbers further, and Brendan Cronin volunteered to join him and Georgia on the first team. The priest's response triggered a peculiar feeling in Georgia, a pang she would not identify as disappointment until much later. Because everyone else had errands to run early tomorrow, the second team was composed of only Ned and Sandy. A rendezvous between the teams was set for 4 o'clock in the morning at the Arco Mini-Mart. "If you get there first," Jack said, "for God's sake, don't buy a hamwich." "Okay, I guess that's it. We should get moving." "Not quite yet," Ginger said. The physician folded her hands and looked down at her interlaced fingers, collecting her thoughts. Since this afternoon, when Brendan first arrived, when the rings appeared on his and Dom's hands, when the motel office was filled with that strange noise in the light, I've been chewing over everything we've been able to learn, trying to make those bizarre phenomena fit in somehow. I've hit on an explanation for some of it, not all, but some of it. Everyone expressed an eagerness to hear the theory, half-formed though it might be. Ginger said, "As different as our dreams are, one element links all of them, the moon." "Okay. Our other dreams, decon suits, IV needles, beds with restraining straps, proved to be based on real experiences, real threats. In fact, they weren't dreams, but memories surfacing in the form of dreams. So it seems reasonable to suppose the moon also featured prominently in whatever happened to us, that the moon, too, is a memory trying to surface in our dreams. Agreed?" "Agreed," Dom said, and everyone else nodded. "We've seen how Marcy's lunar obsession changed to a fascination with a scarlet moon," Ginger continued, "and Jax told us that a couple nights ago, the ordinary moonlight in his own nightmare turned into a bloody glow. None of the rest of us has dreamed of a red moon yet, but I submit that the appearance of the scarlet image in Marcy's and Jack's dreams is proof that it's also a memory. In other words, on the night of July 6th, we saw something that made the moon turn red, and the apparitional light, which sometimes fills Brendan's bedroom, which some of us witnessed today in the motel office, is a strange sort of reenactment of what happened to the real moon on the night in July. The apparitional light is a message meant to nudge our memories. Message, Jack said. All right. But who the devil's sending the message? Where's the light come from? How is it generated? I've got an idea about that, Ginger said, but let me take this one step at a time. First, let's consider what might have happened to make the moon turn red that night. Georgia listened, as did the others, with interest at first, and then with growing uneasiness, while Ginger got up from her chair and, pacing, outlined an unnerving explanation. Ginger Weiss wholeheartedly embraced the scientific worldview. To her, the universe unfailingly operated by the rules of logic and reason, and no mystery could long endure once attacked in a logical fashion. But unlike some in the scientific community and many in the medical community, she did not believe that a vivid imagination was necessarily a hindrance to logic and reason. Otherwise, she might not have devised the theory she now conveyed to the others in the Tranquility Grill. It was a pretty strange theory, and she was nervous about how the others would receive it. So she paced to the jukebox, over to the service counter, back to the table, moving constantly as she talked. The men who dealt with us in the first day or two of imprisonment were wearing decontamination suits designed to handle biological risks. They must have been worried we were infected with something. So perhaps part of what we saw was a scarlet cloud of biological contaminant. When it passed overhead, it turned the moon red. And we were all infected with some strange disease, Georgia said. Ginger said that may be why yesterday at the special place along the highway, I had the memory flash of Dom shouting, "It's inside me! It's inside me!" That would have been a logical thing for him to shout if that night he had found himself caught up in a red cloud of some contaminant and realized he was breathing it in. And Brendan's told us that the same words, "It's inside me," came spontaneously to his lips last night in Reno when the red apparitional light filled his room. Bacteria? Disease? Then why didn't we get sick? Brendan said. Because they treated us immediately, Dom said. We've already worked that one out, Brendan. Yesterday before you got here. But, Ginger, the light that filled the office this afternoon was too bright to represent moonlight filtered through a red cloud. I know, Ginger said, pacing. Underdeveloped as it is, my idea doesn't explain everything, like the rings on your hands, so maybe it's not the right idea. On the other hand, it does explain some things, and maybe if we think about it long enough, we'll see how it explains these other puzzles as well. And as a theory, it has one big plus. What's that? Ned asked. It could explain why Brendan was involved in 2 miracle cures in Chicago. It could explain the whirling paper moons in Zebediah Lomax's house, and the destruction here at the diner on Saturday night when Dom was trying to recall what had happened the summer before last. It could explain the source of the apparitional light. On the jukebox, the last of a series of songs had faded to its end as Ginger began to speak, but no one got up to choose more music, for they were riveted by her promise to explain the inexplicable. To this point, Ginger said, the theory is pretty mundane. A red cloud of contaminant, nothing hard to accept in that. But now, you've got to take a big leap of imagination with me. We've been assuming that the miraculous healing and certainly the poltergeist phenomena have some mysterious external source. Father Wyckowick, Brendan's rector, thinks that external source is God. The rest of us don't feel it's exactly divine. We don't know what the hell it is, but we all assume that it's an external power, something out there somewhere that's taunting us or trying to reach us with a message or threatening us. But what if these wonders have an internal source? Suppose Brendan and Dom really possess some power, and suppose that they possess it because of what happened during the night of the red moon. Suppose they have telekinesis, which is the power to move objects without touching them, which would explain the whirling paper moons and the destruction in the diner. Everyone looked at Dom and Brendan in amazement, but no one was more startled than those two men who gaped at Ginger, shocked. Dom said, "But that's ridiculous. I'm no psychic, no sorcerer." "Me neither," Brendan said. Ginger shook her head. "Not consciously, no. I'm saying maybe the power is in you and you're just not aware of it. Bear with me. Think about it. The first time the rings appeared on Brendan's hands, the first time he exercised his healing power, was when he was combing the hair of the little girl in the hospital. He said he was overwhelmed with pity for her and filled with frustration and anger that he couldn't help her. Maybe it was his intense frustration and anger that freed the power in him, even though he wasn't aware of it. He couldn't be aware of it because the acquisition of this power is part of what he's been made to forget. Okay, the second time with the wounded policeman, Brendan found himself in an extreme crisis, which might trigger these powers. She began pacing and talking more rapidly to prevent debate until she'd finished. Now think about Dom's experiences, the first one in Reno at Lomax's house. The way you told it to us, Dom, as you wandered through the house, you became so frustrated by the ever-deepening nature of the mystery that you wanted to rush through those rooms and tear those paper moons off the walls. Those were your very words, and of course that's what happened. You pulled those moons off the walls, not with your hands, but with this power. And remember, the pictures only fell to the floor when you shouted, 'Stop it! Stop it!' When it did stop, you thought something had hurt you and obeyed or relented, but in fact, you stopped it yourself." Brendan, Dom, and a couple of the others still looked skeptical, but Ginger had captured Sandy Sarver's imagination. It makes sense. It makes even more sense if you think about what happened here on Saturday night, right in this very room. Dom was trying to remember back to that Friday in July, trying to remember what happened right up to the second where his memory block took effect. And while he was struggling to remember, all of a sudden this strange noise, this thunder, started to rumble through the diner, and everything started to shake. He could have been unconsciously using this power of his to recreate the effects of whatever happened back then. "Good," Ginger said encouragingly. "See? The more you think about it, the more it hangs together." "But the strange light," Dom said, "you're saying Brendan and I somehow manufactured that?" "Yes, possibly," Ginger said, returning to the table, leaning on her empty chair. "Pyrokinesis, the ability to spontaneously generate heat or fire with the power of the mind alone." "This wasn't fire," Dom said, "it was light." "So call it photokinesis," Ginger said. "But I think when you and Brendan met, you subconsciously recognized the power in each other. On a deep level, you were both reminded of what happened to you that July night, the thing you've been forced to forget, and both of you wanted to blast those memories into view. So unwittingly, you generated that weird light, which was a recreation of the way the moon changed from white to red on the night of July 6th. It was your subconscious trying to jolt the memory through the block." Ginger could see that their minds were spinning with all these odd ideas, and she wanted to keep them unsettled a while longer, because when they were unsettled, they were more likely to absorb what she was saying. Given time for quiet reflection, the heavy armor of skepticism would fall back into place, and her ideas would bounce off. Ernie Block shook his head. "Wait a minute, you're losing me now. You started all this by suggesting that what turned the moon red was a scarlet cloud of some biological contaminant. Then you jumped way the hell to one side and started talking about how the thing that happened to us was responsible for Dom and Brendan developing these supposed powers. Where's the connection? What does biological contamination have to do with all this psychic stuff anyway? Ginger took a deep breath because they had come to the core of her theory, the wildest part of it. What if we were contaminated by some virus or bacterium that, as a side effect, causes profound chemical or genetic or hormonal changes in its host, changes in the host's brain? And what if those changes leave the host with something very like psychic powers, even once the infection is gone? They stared at her with a variety of expressions, though not as if they thought her mad, and not as if she was too imaginative for her own good. Rather, they seemed impressed by the complex chain of logic which she had forged and by the inevitability of the final link. Good God, Dom said. I doubt that it's the right answer, but it's sure the prettiest, most neatly constructed theory I ever expect to hear. What a concept for a novel. A genetically engineered virus that, as a surprise side effect, causes a sort of forced evolution of the human brain, resulting in psychic powers. For the first time in weeks, I have a terrific urge to rush to a typewriter. Ginger, if we get out of this alive, I'll have to give you a piece of the royalties on the book that's sure to grow out of that idea. Gently rocking her slumbering daughter, Georgia Monatella said, but why couldn't it be the right answer? Why does it just have to be a terrific concept for a novel? For one thing, Jack Twist said, if it were true, if we'd been contaminated with a virus like that, we'd all have developed psychic powers, right? Well, Ginger said, maybe we weren't all contaminated, or maybe we were contaminated, but the virus didn't get a foothold in all of us. Faye said, or maybe the special side effect isn't manifested in everyone who's infected by the bug. Good thought, Ginger said. She began to pace again, this time not because she was nervous, but because she was excited. Ned Sarver pushed one hand through his receding hair and said, are you saying the Army knew about this side effect of the virus? Knew that it might cause these changes in some of us? I don't know, Ginger said. Maybe they knew, maybe not. I think not, Ernie said. Definitely not. From what you found in the Sentinel, we know they closed the interstate shortly before the accident happened, which means it was no accident. So, first of all, I find it hard to believe our own military would intentionally subject us to contamination with a biological warfare microorganism in a harebrained scheme to test its effectiveness in the field. But even if such an atrocity were possible, they wouldn't expose us to a virus that could transform us in the way Ginger has suggested. Because, my friends, people with strong psychic powers would be a new species, a superior breed of humanity. Formidable psychic power would translate directly into military, economic, and political power. So, if the government knew it had a virus that conferred these powers, it would not expose a group of ordinary people like us, not in a million years. That blessing would be reserved for those already in positions of high authority, for the elite. I agree with Dom. I find the red cloud of virus theory quite fascinating, though unlikely. However, if we were contaminated by such a thing, the side effect was unknown to the government. In light of what Ernie had said, everyone was looking at Brendan and Dom with a new appreciation composed equally of awe, uneasiness, wonder, respect, and fear. Ginger saw both the priest and the writer squirm with the exhilarating yet frightening realization that they might have within them the potential for superhuman power, a potential that, if fulfilled, would forever separate them from the rest of mankind. No, Dom said, starting to get up in protest, then sitting back down as if he did not think his legs would support him. No. You're not right, Ginger. I'm no Superman, no wizard, no damn freak. If you were right, I'd feel it. I'd know it, Ginger. Brendan Cronin, equally shaken, said, I've thought that somehow I've been the vehicle for the healing of Emmy and Winton. I've thought that something, not God perhaps, but something is working through me. I never thought of myself as the actual healer. Listen, I was under the impression we'd already decided the toxic spill story was entirely a fake, a cover, that what happened to us wasn't an accident of any kind, neither chemical nor biological, but something altogether different. Jack and Georgia and Faye and Ned started talking at the same time. The noise level rose so loud that little Marcy frowned in her sleep, and Ginger said, Wait a minute. There's no point discussing it because we can't prove there was such a virus any more than we can prove there wasn't one. Not yet. But maybe we can prove the other part. What do you mean? Sandy Sarver asked. Ginger said maybe we can prove Dom and Brendan have the power. Not how they got it, but just that they have it. Dom was incredulous. How? We'll set up a test, Ginger said. Dom was absolutely certain that it would not work, that they were wasting time, that the whole idea was foolish. Yet he was also scared that it would work, and that the proof of his power would condemn him to the condition of a freak, or at least to a life forever closed to ordinary human relationships. If he possessed godlike power, no one would ever regard him without wonder and fear. In even the most relaxed or intimate moments with friends or lovers, their awareness of his extraordinary gifts would intrude, either overtly or in an unspoken subtext. Others, perhaps most, would envy or hate him. The unfairness of his predicament grated on him. For most of his 35 years, he had been shy and ineffectual, condemned to a drab existence by his timidity. Then he had changed, and for 15 months, until his sleepwalking began last October, he'd been outgoing. Now that brief, wonderful season of normality might be passing. If the tests that Ginger outlined were to prove Dom had somehow acquired psychic powers, he would be isolated again, not by his own sense of inferiority as before, but by everyone else's uneasy awareness of his superiority. The test. Dom hoped to God he failed. He and Brendan Cronin were sitting by themselves at the long table, one at each end. Georgia Monatella had put her slumbering daughter in a booth, and the girl had not awakened. The adults, all 7 including Georgia, stood in a semicircle around the table, back a couple of paces, giving Dom and Brendan a space to concentrate free of distraction. A salt shaker stood on the table in front of Dom. Ginger's tests required that he concentrate on moving the object without touching it. Just an inch, she had said. If you can evoke just the slightest perceptible motion in the shaker, we'll know you've got the power. At the far end of the 3 joined tables, a pepper shaker stood in front of Brendan Cronin. The priest was staring at the small glass cylinder as intently as Dom was staring at his own shaker, and his round freckled face was filled with a foreboding only marginally less grim than Dom's. Although Brendan had denied that the hand of God lay behind the miraculous cures and apparitional lights, it was clear to Dom that the priest secretly and deeply hoped to discover that, in fact, a divine presence was at work. He wanted to be drawn back into his faith, into the bosom of the church. If the miracles proved to be his own work, accomplished by the exertion of heretofore unrecognized psychic powers, and if those powers proved to have been conferred by a mere germ, as Ginger's crazy but canny theory would have it, Brendan's yearning for spiritual elevation and holy guidance would be unfulfilled. The salt shaker. Dom fixed his eyes on it and tried to clear every thought from his mind except the determined intention to move the shaker. Although he did not want to discover that he had these strange talents, he had to make a sincere attempt to employ them. He had to know if it were true. If the power existed, neither Ginger nor any of the others could suggest techniques for tapping it. But, Ginger said, if it can explode spontaneously and spectacularly in moments of stress, surely you can learn to call upon it and control it whenever and however you desire, just as a musician can apply his musical talent anytime he pleases, or just as you apply your writing talent to the blank page. The salt shaker remained motionless, unaffected. Dom strove to narrow his attention until that humble glass cylinder, with its perforated stainless steel cap and grainy white contents, was the only thing in his universe. He brought all his mind to bear upon it, every speck of his will, and tried to push it along the table, strained until he realized he was gritting his teeth, fisting his hands. Nothing. He changed tack. Instead of mentally assaulting the shaker as if he were blasting away with a cannon at the mighty walls of a fortress, he relaxed and studied the object to get an intimate sense of its size, shape, and texture. Perhaps the key was to develop an empathy for the shaker. Empathy was the word that seemed right to him, though he was relating to an inanimate and inorganic object. Instead of battling it, perhaps he could empathize and somehow induce it to cooperate in a short telekinetic journey. Only an inch. He leaned forward slightly to better examine the functional simplicity of its design. 5 beveled facets to make it easy to grip and hold, a thick glass bottom to provide balance and reduce the frequency of spills, a shiny metal cap. Nothing. Standing unaffected on the table before him, the shaker seemed like the mythical, immovable object, heavy beyond weighing, welded forever to this spot in space and time. But, of course, like all forms of matter in the universe, it was not immovable, and in some ways it was always moving, never still. After all, it was composed of billions of ceaselessly moving atoms, the outer parts of which orbited planet-like around the billions of sun-like nuclei. The salt shaker was engaged in uninterrupted motion on a subatomic level, frantically moving within its structure, so it should not be difficult to induce it to make one additional movement, one little jaunt on the macrocosmic level of human perception. Just one little hop and skip, just one. Dom felt a sudden buoyancy, almost as if he himself were going to be moved by some arcane force. But instead, and at last, the salt shaker moved. He had become so deeply involved with that homely object that he had actually forgotten Ginger and the others. He was reminded of their presence when, as one, they gasped and exclaimed softly. The shaker did not simply slide 1 inch along the table, or 2, or 10, or 20. It rose into the air instead, as if gravity had ceased to have a claim on it. Like a tiny glass balloon, it floated upward, 1 foot, 2, 3, and stopped 4 feet above the surface on which, only seconds ago, it had appeared immovable. It remained suspended several inches above the eye level of those who were standing, and they stared up at it in awe. At the far end of the table, Brendan's pepper shaker rose too. Mouth open, eyes wide, Brendan stared at the rising cylinder. When it stopped at precisely the same height as the salt shaker, Brendan finally dared to take his eyes from it. He looked at Dom, glanced nervously at the pepper shaker again, as if certain it would crash down the moment he shifted his gaze, then looked at Dom once more when he realized that eye contact was not required to maintain levitation. Several sentiments were apparent in the priest's eyes: wonder, amazement, puzzlement, fear, and an emotional acknowledgement of the profound brotherhood that existed between him and Dom by virtue of the strange power they shared. Dom was intrigued that he did not need to strain to keep the salt shaker aloft. In fact, it seemed hard to believe that he was actually responsible for its magical performance. He was not conscious of either possessing or exerting control of the object. He felt no power surging in him. Evidently, his telekinetic ability functioned automatically in a fashion similar to respiration and heartbeat. Brandon raised his hands. The red rings had reappeared on them. Dom looked at his own hands and saw the same inscrutable stigmata burning brightly. What did they mean? Looming overhead, the salt and pepper shakers generated a sense of expectancy in Dom, even greater than he had felt at the beginning of this test. Apparently, the others felt it as well, for they began to urge Dom and Brendan to perform additional feats. Incredible, Ginger said breathlessly. You've shown us vertical movement, levitation. Can you also move them horizontally? Can you lift something heavier? Sandy Sarver asked. The light, Ernie said. Can you generate the red light? Seeking first to accomplish a more modest task than any they had proposed, Dom thought about giving the salt shaker a slight spin, and immediately it began to twirl in midair, eliciting another gasp from the onlookers. A moment later, Brendan's pepper shaker began to spin too. Reflections of the overhead lights glimmered liquidly across the shiny metal caps of the spinning dispensers, flashed off the facets of the glass, traveled scintillatingly along the edges where one facet met another, so the shakers looked like glittery Christmas tree ornaments. Simultaneously, the two small dispensers began drifting toward one another, the horizontal movement Ginger had requested, though Dom was not aware of consciously directing the salt shaker on this course. He supposed Ginger's suggestion was accepted by his subconscious, which now employed psychic energy to accomplish the task without waiting for him to make a conscious effort. It was eerie, the way he controlled the shaker yet was unaware of how that control was exerted. Above the centermost point of the three-joined tables, the salt and pepper shakers stopped moving horizontally when they were about 10 inches apart. They hung side by side, spinning a bit faster than before, throwing off spangles of reflected light. Then they began to revolve around each other in perfectly circular, synchronized orbits, but that lasted only a few seconds. Suddenly, the shakers were spinning faster than before and swinging around each other much faster as well, and in much more complex parabolic counter-orbits. Captivated and delighted, the onlookers laughed, applauded. Dom looked at Ginger. Her radiant face shone with an expression of pure spiritual uplift that made her more beautiful than ever. She lowered her gaze from the salt and pepper shakers to Dom, grinning with wild excitement, and gave him a thumbs-up sign. Ernie Block and Jack Twist watched the aerobatics with open-mouthed wonder that made them look not like hard-bitten ex-soldiers, but like two small boys seeing fireworks for the first time in their lives. Laughing, Faye stood with her hands raised toward the shakers as if she were trying to feel the miraculous field of power in which they were suspended. Ned Sarver was laughing too, but Sandy was crying, a sight that startled Dom until he realized she was also smiling, and that the tears in her cheeks were tears of joy. Oh, Sandy said, turning to Dom, as if she had sensed that he was looking at her. Isn't it wonderful? Whatever it means, isn't it just wonderful? The freedom of it, the breaking away of all the bonds, the rising up and above and away. Dom knew precisely what she was feeling and trying to say because he felt it too. For the moment, he forgot that possession of these abilities would forever alienate him from people who were without the talent, and he was filled with a rapturous sense of transcendence, with an appreciation for what it might mean to take a giant leap up the ladder of evolution, breaking away from the chains of human limitations. In the Tranquility Grill tonight, there was a sense of history being made, a sense that nothing in the world would ever be the same again. "Do something else," Ginger said. "Yes," Sandy said. "Show us more, show us more." In other parts of the room, other salt shakers flew up from the tables on which they had been standing. 6, 8, 10 in all. They hung motionless for a moment, then began to spin like the first shaker. Instantly, an equal number of pepper shakers took flight and began spinning as well. Dom still did not know how he was doing these things. He had made no effort to perform each new trick. The thought merely became fact, as if wishes could come true. He suspected that Brendan was equally baffled. The jukebox had been silent. Now it began to play a Dolly Parton tune, though no one had punched the programming buttons. Did I do that, Dom wondered, or was it Brendan? Ginger said, "My God, I'm so excited, I'm going to Plots." Laughing, Dom said, "Plots, what's that one mean?" "Bust. Explode," Ginger said. "I'm so excited, I'm going to bust." Every salt and pepper shaker spun, and the halves of every pair orbited each other, and now all 11 sets began moving around the room in a train, faster, faster, making a soft whoosh as they cut the air, casting off sparks of reflected light. Abruptly, a dozen chairs rose off the floor, not in the controlled and playful manner in which the salt and pepper shakers had risen from the tables, but with such violence and momentum that they shot instantly to the ceiling, smashing against that barrier with a deafening clatter. One of the wagon wheel lighting fixtures was struck by 2 chairs. Its light bulbs burst, and the room was only 3/4 as brightly illuminated as it had been. That wagon wheel broke loose of its anchor brackets and wires, crashing to the floor a few feet behind Dom. The chairs remained against the ceiling, vibrating as if they were a flock of enormous bats hovering on dark wings. Most of the salt and pepper shakers were still whirling maniacally around the room, above everyone's head, though a few had been brought down by upflung chairs. Now a few more stopped spinning, swung erratically out of their orbits, out of the train as well, wobbled and shot to the floor. One of them struck Ernie's shoulder, and he cried out in pain. Dom and Brendan had lost control, and because they had never known exactly how they had established control in the first place, they did not know how to regain it. In a blink, the celebratory mood changed to panic. The onlookers scrambled for shelter under the tables, acutely aware that the levitated chairs, rattling ominously against the ceiling, were potentially far more dangerous missiles than the salt and pepper shakers. The noise awakened Marcy. She sat up in the booth where she had been sleeping, crying now and calling for her mother. Georgia pulled the girl off the booth and scrambled under one of the tables with her, hugging her close, and everyone was out of the line of fire except Brendan and Dom. Dom felt as if this psychic power was a live grenade that had been wired irremovably to his hand. Overhead, 3 or 4 more shakers lost momentum and came down like bullets. The dozen levitated chairs began to bounce against the ceiling more aggressively, shedding small pieces of themselves. Dom didn't know if he should dive for cover or attempt to regain control. He looked at Brendan, who was equally paralyzed. Overhead, the 3 remaining wagon wheel lights swayed wildly on their chains, causing goblin shadows to leap across the room. The battering chairs gouged out small chunks of the ceiling. A salt shaker dropped in front of Dom, impacting like a tiny meteorite against the table. The glass was too thick to shatter, but the small jar cracked into 3 or 4 pieces, flinging out what salt it still contained, and Dom flinched from the white spray. Remembering the spinning carousel paper moons in Lomax's house 6 days ago, Dom raised both hands toward the rattling chairs and whirling shakers. Clenching his hands into fists, shutting the red ring stigmata out of sight, he said, "Stop it! Stop it now! Stop it!" Overhead, the chairs ceased vibrating. The salt and pepper shakers halted in mid-whirl and hung motionless in the air. For a second or two, the diner was preternaturally silent. Then the 12 chairs and the last of the shakers dropped straight down, bouncing off tables and other chairs that had never taken flight. When everything at last came to rest in tangled rubble, Dom and Brendan were as unscathed as those who had taken refuge under the tables. Dom blinked at the priest, and around them all was graveyard still. This moment of silence was longer than the first. It seemed as if time had stopped until Marcy's thin whimpering and her mother's murmured assurances started the engines of reality purring again, drawing the others from their places of shelter. Ernie was still massaging his shoulder where he had been hit by a salt shaker, but he was not seriously hurt. No one else was injured, though everyone was shaken. Dom saw the way they were looking at him and Brendan, warily, just as he figured they would look at him if he proved to have the power, just the way he had dreaded being looked at. Damn. Ginger seemed to be the only one who was not put off by his new status. She enthusiastically embraced Dom and said, "What matters is that you've got it. You've got it, and eventually you can learn to use it, and that's wonderful." "I'm not so sure," Dom said, looking at the broken chairs, fallen lighting fixtures. Jack Twist was brushing salt and drywall dust off his clothes. Georgia was still comforting her frightened child. Faye and Sandy were picking splinters and other bits of debris out of their hair. And Ned was pondering the danger of the live wires dangling from the ceiling where the chandelier had torn loose. Dom said, "Ginger, even when I was using the power, I didn't know how I was doing it. And when it ran wild, I didn't know how to stop it." "But you did stop it," she said. She kept one arm around his waist as if she knew, God bless her, that he needed the reassurance of human contact. "You did stop it, Dom." "Maybe next time I won't be able." He realized he was shivering. "Look at this mess. My God, Ginger, someone could have been badly hurt." "No one was. Someone could have been killed. Next time, it'll be better," she said. Brendan Cronin came around the long table. "He'll change his mind, Ginger. Give him time. I know I'm going to try again, alone next time, in a couple of days when I've had time to think it through. I'll go out somewhere in an open field, away from people, where no one can be hurt except me, and I'll give it another try. I think it's going to be difficult to control the energy. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of work, maybe years. But I'll explore, practice, and so will Dom. He'll realize as much when he's had a couple of minutes to think about it." Dom shook his head. "I don't want this. I don't want to be so different from other people." "But now you are," Brendan said. "We both are." "That's damn fatalistic." Brendan smiled. "Though I'm having a crisis of faith, I'm still a priest. So I believe in predestination, fate. That's an article of faith. But we priests are a clever bunch, so we can be fatalistic and believe in free will at the same time. Both are articles of faith." For the priests, the psychological effects of these events were far different from the fear raised in Dom. As he talked, he repeatedly rose onto his toes, as if he were nearly buoyant enough to float away. At a loss to understand the priest's good humor, Dom changed the subject. "Well, Ginger, if we've proved half of your crazy theory, at least we've disproved the other half." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "In the midst of all that uproar," Dom said, gesturing toward the battered ceiling, "when I saw the rings appear on my hands again, I decided the psychic power wasn't a side effect of any strange viral infection. I know the source of it is something else, something even stranger, though I don't know what it may be." "Oh, well, which is the case?" she asked. "Have you merely decided, or do you really know?" "I know," Dom said. "Deep inside, I know." "Oh, yes, me too," Brendan said happily, as Ernie and Faye and the others gathered around. "You were correct, Ginger, when you suggested the power was in Dom and me, and it's been in us since that July night, like you said. However, you're not right about the method by which we acquired the gift. Like Dom said, in the middle of all the chaos, I sensed that biological contamination wasn't the right explanation. I haven't the foggiest notion what the answer is, but we can rule out that part of your theory. Now Dom understood why Brendan was in such good spirits in spite of the frightening exhibition in which they just participated. Though he professed to see no religious aspect to recent events, in his heart of hearts the priest had retained hope that the miraculous cures and apparitional lights were of divine origin. He had been depressed by the dismayingly secular thought that the gift could have been bestowed on him not by his Lord, but simply as a chance side effect of an exotic infection, by the unwitting office of a mindless virus, and a man-made virus as well. He was relieved to be able to dismiss that possibility. His high spirits and good humor, even amidst the destruction of the diner, arose from the fact that a divine presence was once again, for Brendan at least, a viable, if still unlikely, explanation. Dom wished he too could find courage and strength in the notion that their troubles were part of a divine scheme, but at the moment he believed only in danger and death, twin juggernauts that he sensed bearing down on him. The personality changes that had occurred in him during his move from Portland to Mountain View were laughably minor in comparison to the changes that had begun working in him tonight with the discovery of this unwanted power. He almost felt as if the power was alive in him, a parasite that in time would eat away everything that had been Dominic Corvasis, and having assumed his identity, would stalk the world in his body, masquerading as human. Crazy. Nevertheless, he was worried and scared. He looked at each of the others who were gathered around him. Some met his eyes for a moment, then quickly looked away, just as one might hesitate to meet the gaze of a dangerous or intimidating man. Others, most notably Jack Twist, Ernie, and Georgia, met his eyes forthrightly, but were incapable of concealing the uneasiness and even apprehension with which they now regarded him. Only Ginger and Brendan seemed to have suffered no change in their attitude toward him. "Well," Jack said, breaking the spell, "we should call it a night, I guess. We've got a lot to do tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Ginger said, "we'll have cleared up even more of these mysteries. We're making progress every day." "Tomorrow," Brendan said softly, happily, "will be a day of great revelation. I feel it somehow." Tomorrow, Dom thought, we might all be dead, or wish we were. Colonel Leland Falkirk still had a splitting headache. With his new talent for introspection, acquired gradually since his involvement in the emotionally and intellectually shattering events of 2 summers ago, he was able to see that, on one level, he was actually glad that the aspirin had been ineffective. He thrived on the headache in the same way he thrived on other kinds of pain, drawing a perverse strength and energy from the relentless throbbing in his brow and temples. Lieutenant Horner had gone. Leland was alone once more in his temporary, windowless office beneath the testing grounds of Shankfield. But he was no longer waiting for the call from Chicago. It had come soon after Horner departed, and the news had been all bad. The siege at Calvin Sharkle's house in Evanston, which had begun earlier today, was still underway, and that volatile situation would probably not be brought to an end within the next 12 hours. If possible, the colonel did not want to commit his men to another closure of I-80 and another quarantine of the Tranquility Motel until he could be certain the operation would not be compromised by revelations that Sharkle might make either to Illinois authorities or to the news media. Delay made Leland nervous, especially now that the witnesses at the motel were focused on Thunder Hill and were planning their moves beyond the reach of rifle microphones and infinity transmitters. He figured he could afford to wait at most one more day. However, if the dangerous standoff in Illinois was still underway by sunset tomorrow, he would give the order to move on the Tranquility in spite of the risks. The other news from Chicago was that operatives had discreetly investigated Emmeline Halborg and Winton Tolk and had found reasons to believe their amazing recoveries could not be adequately explained by current medical knowledge, and a reconstruction of Father Stefan Wykazik's activities on Christmas Day, including visits to Halborg and Tolk and a stop at the Metropolitan Police Laboratory to consult a ballistics expert, confirmed that the priest had been convinced that his curate, Brendan Cronin, had been responsible for those miraculous cures. Leland had first become aware of Cronin's healing powers just yesterday, Sunday, when he had monitored a telephone call between Dominic Corvasis at the Tranquility and Father Wykazik in Chicago. That conversation would have been a real shocker if the events of Saturday night had not prepared him for the unexpected. Saturday night, when Corvasis had arrived at the Tranquility, Leland Falkirk and his surveillance experts had monitored the first conversations between the Blocks and the writer with growing disbelief. The outlandish tale of moon photographs animated by a poltergeist in Lomax Reno House had sounded like the product of a fevered mind no longer able to distinguish between fiction and reality. Later, however, after Corvasis and the Blocks had eaten dinner at the grill, the writer had attempted to relive the minutes just before the trouble had started on the night of July 6. What happened then was astonishing, confirmed both by the hidden surveillance team watching the Tranquility from a point south of the interstate and by the Infinity transmitter tap on the diner's payphone. Everything in the grill had begun to shake, and a strange rumble had filled the place, then an eerie electronic ululation culminating in the implosion of all the windows. These phenomena came as a total and nasty surprise to Leland and to everyone involved in the cover-up, especially the scientists who were electrified. The following day's discovery of Cronin's healing power added voltage to the excitement. At first, these developments seemed inexplicable, but after only a little thought, Leland arrived at an explanation that made his blood cold. The scientists had come to similar conclusions. Some of them were as scared as Leland was. Suddenly, no one knew what to expect. Anything might happen now. We believed we were in control of the situation that night in July, Leland thought somberly, but perhaps it had escalated beyond our control even before we arrived on the scene. The single consolation was that, thus far, only Corvasis and the priest appeared to be infected. Maybe infected wasn't exactly the right word. Maybe possessed was better. Or maybe there wasn't a word for what had happened to them, because what had happened to them had never happened to anyone else in history, so a specific word for it had not heretofore been required. Even if the siege at Sharkle's house ended tomorrow, even if that possibility of media exposure was eliminated, Leland would not be able to strike at the group at the motel with full confidence. Corvasis and Cronin, and perhaps the others, might be more difficult to apprehend and incarcerate than they'd been 2 summers ago. If Corvasis and Cronin weren't entirely themselves anymore, if they were now someone else or something else, dealing with them might prove downright impossible. Leland's headache grew worse. Feed on it, he told himself, getting up from the desk. Feed on the pain. You've been doing that for years, you dumb son of a bitch. So you can feed on it for another day or 2 until you've dealt with this mess, or until you're dead, whichever comes first. He left the windowless office, crossed a windowless outer chamber, walked a windowless hall, and entered the windowless communications center where Lieutenant Horner and Sergeant Vick sat at a table in one corner. Tell the men they can hit the sack, Leland said. It's off for tonight. I'll risk another day to see if the situation at Sharkle's house gets resolved. I was just coming to you, Horner said. There's a development at the motel. They finally left the diner. After they came out, Twist brought a Jeep Cherokee in from the hills behind the motel. He, Georgia Monatella, and the priest piled in it and drove off toward Elko. "Where the hell are they going at this time of night?" Leland asked, uncomfortably aware that those three might have slipped through his fingers if he had ordered his men to move against the motel tonight, for he'd been certain the witnesses were settled down until morning. Horner pointed to Fix, who was wearing headphones and listening to the tranquility. "From what we've heard, the others are going to bed. Twist, Monatella, and Cronin have gone off as a sort of insurance against us getting our hands on all the witnesses in one clean sweep. This had to be Twist's idea." Damn. Massaging his throbbing temples with his fingertips, Leland sighed. "All right, we aren't going after them tonight anyway. But what about tomorrow? What if they split up all day tomorrow?" "In the morning," Leland said, "we'll put tails on all of them." To this point, he had seen no need to tell the witnesses everywhere they went, for he had known that in the end they would all wind up in the same place, the motel, making it easier for him to deal with them. But now, if they were going to be spread out when the time came to take them into custody, he would need to know where they were at all times. Horner said, "Depending on where they go tomorrow, they're likely to spot any tails we put on them. In this kind of open country, it's not easy to be discreet." "I know," Leland said, "so let them see us. I've wanted to stay out of sight, but we're at the end of that approach. Maybe seeing us will throw them off balance until it's too late. Maybe scared they'll even get back together for protection and make our job easier again." "If we have to take some of them at a place other than the motel, say in Elko, it'll be difficult," Horner said worriedly. "If they can't be taken, they've got to be killed." Leland pulled up a chair, sat down. "Let's work out surveillance details now and have the tails in position before dawn."